Kendo competitions were held in a large gymnasium. A large bright banner hung near the stands. The jury watched two people fight with wooden swords. They were dressed in black clothes and protective masks. One of the fighters hit his opponent right in the face with his sword. Then, he struck his opponent's hands. His movements were refined. He deftly wielded his sword and dodged. The blows hit the opponent's head, arms and body with lightning speed. The enemy was no longer able to stand on his feet. He sat down on the floor. The commentator exclaimed in amazement that swordsman Yoshiho finished all rounds within 20 seconds each. The main character continued to stand with a wooden sword in his hand when the commentator admitted that he had seen many swordsmen, but never one like him. He called Yoshiho an undisputed master. The guy put his long wooden sword in front of him. The main character began to remove the protective helmet from his head. The commentator continued to praise him and his talent. Yoshiho had black hair styled down and his eyes were brown. 3 years later, the sky was scarlet and there was a heavy rainfall. The bright sign of the nightclub glowed even through the rain. In the light of the red spotlights, Yoshiho walked with a real katana in his hand. He was dressed in a formal suit. One of the soffits that drained the blue light was cracked. Another spotlight illuminated the club brightly with red light. There was a roar and groans. Near the stage, on the dance floor, a battle took place. Many men lay unconscious on the floor. Yoshiho's blade flashed as he walked towards the 3 bandits. One of them suggested killing the guy. One man had a bat with nails, the second had a metal pipe in his hands, and the last one was holding a switched-on chainsaw in his hands. They decided to attack the guy from all sides, because they decided that he would not be able to repel this. Scarlet blood dripped from the tip of the katana. There was a haze in the club. Yoshiho continued to look at the enemies who were about to attack him. The main character's face was partially hidden in shadow. The shaven-headed bandit frowned, sweat dripping down his forehead. His ally had a goatee and veins bulged on his face. The last bandit finished the countdown by shouting loudly. They surrounded the main character, who didn't even flinch. The guy narrowed his eyes. His pupils seemed to leave a trace in the air. He stabbed the bald bandit through with his katana. The capillaries in the bandit's eyes burst and blood began to flow from his body. When Yoshiho pulled out the blade from the enemy's body, he was attacked by a man with a metal pipe. The main character swung his katana at an enemy with a chainsaw. He hit the enemy's hands with his blade, cutting off his hands. The severed body parts fell to the floor along with the chainsaw. The bandit looked in horror at the blood spraying from his stumps. Behind Yoshiho, a man was swinging a pipe at him. The main character turned sharply towards him, striking him with a katana. He swung his weapon several times. His face remained cool as he fought. The enemy's entire face was covered with small bleeding cuts. There were many wounds on his body from which blood was gushing. Yoshiho dealt the final blow, cutting off his enemy's arm. The rain outside the club did not stop. Steam was coming from the main character's mouth, and someone else's blood was dripping from his face. The shaven-headed bandit lay on the floor, covering his wound with his hand. He, breathing heavily, asked the guy who he was. Yoshiho did not answer him, lowering his gaze. Suddenly he raised his eyes, paying attention to something. The guy in the red suit was clapping his hands while smoking a cigar. He told the main character that he is dangerous and just chops people into pieces. Yoshiho looked at him from under his brows, lowering his eyelids. The guy with the cigar's pupils shrank and he smiled madly. They both understood that one of them would die. Blood was dripping from Yoshiho's temple, and he invited the guy to unite. The stranger's face was hidden by tobacco smoke. There were drops of blood on the main character's right cheek. He said that the guy killed his sister and because of him his mother died. He raised his katana up. The tip of the blade was aimed at the stranger's neck. Yoshiho looked emotionless and cold as he held the guy at gunpoint. The stranger continued to smoke a cigar while standing on stage while the main character pointed a katana at him. Gangnam, 2 years ago. The sky was gloomy, it was raining, and the street was illuminated by a dim lantern. There was a light on in one of the buildings. Yoshiho wished his mother a good night. It was dark in the window, but you could see the light from the TV. In the living room of Yoshiho's house, there was a TV showing news about the economic situation. A kendo dojo appeared on the screen. The news presenter said that in one of the Seoul districts, fast food outlets were completely eliminated, even kendo and taekwondo clubs. They hoped that small businesses would continue to exist. He moved on to the rest of the news and a sketchy image of a woman appeared on the screen. A news anchor said cases of burglaries and murders have increased in Seoul, with single women living in studio apartments being targeted. Surviving victims are outraged at how many more murders it takes for the police to deal with these robbers and murderers. Yoshiho didn't listen to the news, so he pressed the power button on the remote control. He began to climb the stairs to the second floor. The light was on in the window, and the rain did not stop. The main character entered the room where his kendo trophies lay, and paintings hung on the walls. He stood in front of the closet with the sports uniform. The guy picked up one of the gold awards. His face was reflected in the glass. Then, he put the cup in a cardboard box. While he was putting away the rest of the awards and certificates, his phone rang. He answered the call, picking up his white smartphone. The interlocutor asked if he had retired from sports. The main character lowered his gaze and answered affirmatively, addressing the caller as a master. The interlocutor ordered to call him Mr. Director and said that his talent must definitely be put to use. The box was filled to the brim with trophies, including the World Kendo Championships. The director said that if he wants to make money, the only way is to open his own kendo dojo. Ishiho held the phone with his shoulder and sorted out his trophies, answering the director that he needed a regular job. The guy picked up the box from the floor. The interlocutor said that he could get the guy into his dojo and would pay him good wages. The main character replied that it was enough for him, that he had not forgotten about him. The director called him a boring person and asked if he had found a job. Ishiho looked at the framed photograph of a woman standing and him holding a baby. He replied that his mother could not cope with the restaurant alone and he planned to help her. The director said that he would have to set the broth to boil every day at dawn and work more than 12 hours a day. The main character removed the phone from his ear and replied that he needed to pack his things and would call back. He started going through old photographs. A photograph of him as a child in kendo clothes flew into the box. The guy looked at the rest of the photographs with a disinterested face. In his hands he held a childhood photo of him standing next to his younger sister and mother. Then, he found a photo of his sister where he was holding a golden statuette. This figurine stood on his desk next to his phone and a framed photograph. He found a photo with his mother and sister in a restaurant when he returned from the army. Ishiho's eyelids were drooping and did not express any emotion. He looked at his mother, who already had gray hair and wrinkles. The main character put this photo aside. In his hands was a photograph with a group of people. He remembered how his sister took a photo of him and his mother using a selfie stick near the university. The red-haired sister looked at the photo and displeasedly asked her brother why he always has such a face, and when will he smile. She started to get annoyed and said that he was annoying her and it was no wonder he hadn't gotten married yet. Ishiho remained silent, turning away from her. Their mother looked at her sister with concern and asked if she really decided to live alone in Seoul. The girl replied that it was safe there and she was worrying in vain. While the main character was looking at the bush, the sister said that there are many provincial applicants like her in Seoul, and they are finding a place for themselves. Ishiho picked a leaf from a bush and attracted the family's attention. He told his sister that if something happened, she should draw an infinity sign. The girl looked at him a little surprised and asked about the infinity sign. The main character lowers his gaze without saying anything else. He remembered when he was beaten as a schoolboy. He turned to his sister and asked how she was. The girl started crying and asked her brother why he didn't run away. He smiled softly, closing his eyes, and replied that it was because he loved her endlessly. While on campus, he held a piece of paper in his hands. It resembled an infinity sign, and the main character said that it was like a figure 8, only horizontal. His sister Yeon crossed her arms in displeasure and asked if he thought something might happen to her. She started talking about their family when suddenly she noticed someone. She called out to a girl with short hair named Sua, who also recognized her. Sua approached them and Yeon told her mother that this was her friend and she would also rent a studio and live alone. They offered to take a photo together. In the photo, Mom, Yeon and Sua were smiling while Ishiho was looking away. The main character threw this photo into the box with the other photos. Suddenly his phone began to vibrate and he turned around. The guy took the phone from the table, touching the figurine of a kendo master. The figurine fell to the floor and broke into pieces. Holding the phone in his hands, Ishiho looked at the floor. It was still raining outside and raindrops were hitting the glass. The main character looked at the phone screen with no interest. Suddenly his pupils constricted and he felt horror. He remembered a news report about single women living in studio apartments being killed in Seoul. The news anchor's face blurred in his head. The notification on his phone dimmed his vision. On the phone screen was his message to his sister that he should come. Ishiho put the phone to his ear and started calling her. No one answered the call, and he looked at the black screen of the phone. The guy dialed the emergency number. He began calling them while the rain outside continued. There were no lights on in the gray apartment building. It was dark on the top floor. The light was on in the bathroom and someone was humming a tune there. The man washed his hands in the sink. The door was slightly open, light leaking into the room. The creepy face of a man appeared in the doorway, water dripping from his hands. He said it was easy and simple. He went into the room where another man was standing in a cap. He held a notebook in his hands and said that the same drawing was repeated hundreds of times on the pages. He took a step forward and suggested that she was mentally ill, after which he told his partner to grab everything valuable and leave. Lee Si-yeon's phone received a call from Lee Shiho, and the robbers said that he was texting her to say that he would come because she was not answering her calls. The man in the cap threw away his notebook and told his partner to leave. They slammed the doors behind them loudly. In the middle of the room, Lee Si-yeon's corpse was hanging in front of the front door. Her body was hanged, and on the floor lay a notebook where an infinity sign was drawn many times, and a leaf was also inserted. Lee Si-yeon's funeral photo was surrounded by white flowers. There was fruit around her memorial and incense smoked on the shelves. Lee Shiho and the two funeral ceremony attendees bowed deeply. He was talking to them when Siyu arrived there. She was dressed in a black suit and was holding a white handbag. The main character noticed her, looking at her with an emotionless face. The incense had almost burned out, and a candle was burning nearby. Lee Shiho approached the girl and asked if she wanted to put incense. She thanked him and refused, saying that she just felt really bad right now. Siyu looked at the guy and asked where their mother was. He looked back and replied that she had to lie down. Her legs couldn't support her. The girl straightened her hair and said that he didn't have to accompany her, she would come on her own. She and Lee Shiho walked down the corridor next to the flowers. Siyu noticed one of the flower wreaths. On it hung a black and white ribbon with an inscription. The girl's face was distorted and she seemed disgusted. Lee Shiho looked down with an emotionless face. Siyu looked at him and asked if she could talk to him, just not here. The main character took a glass of coffee from the vending machine. Siyu was sitting on the bench next to him. She was biting her thumb. Lee Shiho walked up to her and asked what she wanted to talk about. The girl looked at him with a worried face. The main character looked indifferent. His eyelids were slightly drooping. Siyu began to get angry and asked displeasedly how this was possible, since he didn't look sad at all. She stated that Lee Si-yeon said that he always has the same expression on his face, like he is a psychopath, and now she is convinced that Lee Si-yeon was right. Lee Shiho's bangs covered his eyes. He didn't answer her. He remembered again how his crying sister asked him why he didn't run away. He replied that it was because he loved her. The girl looked at him pitifully. She cried bitterly and said that she thought he was an insensitive psychopath. Lee Si-yeon pursed her lips and Lee Shiho patted her head. Now he was holding a glass of coffee, silently looking at Siyu. He looked at the steam coming from the drink and asked the girl what she wanted to talk about. Siyu was angry and she asked how he could be so calm when his sister died. The main character turned away from her and said that he would have to return to work. He was only released for a short time for the funeral. The girl remained silent, and the guy added that if she had nothing to say, then he would go. Siyu picked up her bag and stood up from the bench. A glass of coffee stood on the armrest of the bench. Lee Shiho put his hands in his pants pockets and walked down the corridor with wreaths of white flowers. Suddenly he stopped, paying attention to something. He was attracted by the same wreath that Siyu was looking at. In 3 days, the sky was orange-pink at sunset, and the lights were on in the apartment where Lee Si-yeon lived. Lee Shiho sat on the bed and held a magazine in his hands. It was the donation report he was studying. He saw that Flash's sales representative named In-sung had donated 1,000,000 won. The main character went to the dressing table, where there was a lot of cosmetics. He looked into her closet and looked at the black dress. Then, a blue box on the other side caught his attention. Inside was a red notebook. He picked it up and started leafing through it. On one of the pages was a photo of Lee Si-yeon with Siyu against the backdrop of neon flash. Lee Shiho maintained his indifferent face. He continued to leaf through the girl's diary. Suddenly his face distorted into a grimace of horror. His pupils reflected the many infinity signs she drew. University building. The sky was blue and cloudy. The main character was sitting on a bench. The students turned to look at him. A man with a guitar on his back asked who it was. His girlfriend told him that she had not seen him before. Lee Shiho had a hood on his head and looked up. Siyu approached him and he stood up from the bench. She frowned with displeasure and asked what he was doing here. The main character showed her a photo of Lee Si-yeon and asked where it was taken. The girl lowered her eyebrows and replied that it was at the club. Lee Shiho looked at her sternly and replied that this is not a club. Siyu looked confused and her mouth opened slightly. The girl lowered her gaze, beginning to remember. A sign for the flash bar appeared in her head. The doors were open and the sign turned on and turned red. Siyu and Lee Si-yeon were riding in the elevator, looking at their phones. Lee Si-yeon straightened her hair and looked at her friend's phone. She typed a message, introducing herself by a different name, and said that she was from the Flash Bar. She wrote that from today, for 3 days, a bikini event will be held at the bar, and if the interlocutor arrives before 6 p.m., he will receive a free dinner. Lee Si-yeon turned away in disgust and asked if it was necessary to advertise the event in such a vulgar manner. Si replied that she shouldn't have peeked. The girl started to get out of the elevator, and Lee Si-yeon admitted that she hates writing sales texts. Her friend told her that she just needed to copy and paste the text. The clock said 5, and there was a sign nearby stating that only employees were allowed to enter. In the dressing room, the girls were choosing their swimsuits. Lee Si-yeon was already wearing a bikini with a peignoir and was taking pictures of herself with a camera. She told Siyu, who was standing near the mirror, that she looked beautiful today. The short-haired girl replied that she was always a beauty. The red-haired girl took out a photograph and invited her friend to take a photo as a souvenir. Siyu asked if she had gone crazy and suddenly someone would see this later. Lee Si-yeon pointed the camera at her friend and replied that this was a gift from a client and she could indulge herself. Siyu asked if he was from the Hongdae Club. After that they took a photo. The coffee shop with a green sign was made in beige tones. Siyu looked at the photo on the table and said that she and Lee Si-yeon worked at a nightclub. She was sitting at a table with Lee Si-ho, who asked if the nightclub had alcohol and cocktails. The girl answered in the affirmative. She straightened her hair and said that the owner of the club usually stands behind the counter and talks to customers, and it was he who sent that wreath to the funeral. The protagonist's gaze was cool and he asked if it was a strip bar. Covering her face with her hand, Siyu looked at him. She lowered her gaze and replied that this was not that kind of place. Their task was simply to sit next to the clients. They were not allowed to touch them, and any perverts were immediately kicked out of the club. The girl admitted that she took this job to pay for her studies. Lee Si-ho looked at her silently. He put his hands on his knees and asked if she had hidden anything from him. Siyu chewed her thumbnail out of excitement. Suddenly she noticed the silhouette of a stranger on the street. She was horrified, her pupils constricted. She folded her hands over her stomach and answered in the negative, her voice trembling. The guy continued to look at her with an emotionless face. Siyu stood up from her chair and said that she had to go to class, and then said goodbye. Lee Si-ho lowered his gaze and looked at his bandaged fists. His fingers were pale and thin. He remembered how he hit something with fury. This took place in the apartment of his late sister. Out of anger, he hit the cabinet, breaking the door. The main character clenched his teeth and breathed heavily. Drops of blood fell onto the torn page of the diary. His fists were bleeding heavily, and in his hand he was clutching a piece of paper with infinity signs. Sitting in the coffee shop, he clenched his fist tighter. Lee Si-ho looked down, thinking that this was definitely not suicide. His gaze became cold and cruel, and his fists began to bleed again. Police station. There were a lot of cars in the parking lot. There was a checkpoint at the entrance. The main character was sitting in the compartment opposite the employee's desk. The black-haired man looked at him uninterestedly and asked if he was saying that his sister was killed and if there was any evidence. There was a lattice door in the room. Lee Si-ho said that he and his sister agreed to warn each other with an infinity sign when they were in danger. The police officer put his head on his hand and asked how they exchanged this sign. The main character looked straight at him and replied that back in high school they decided to send the number 8. The investigator asked why she warned him and did not call the police. Lee Si-ho remembered those drawings in the diary and guessed that she couldn't tell him about working at the bar, so she just wrote it down in a notebook. The investigator looked at him with disdain. He sat back in his chair and asked if the funeral had already taken place and if she had been cremated. He stated that an autopsy would have been required to determine whether it was a homicide or suicide. But when the death was initially reported, the guy ruled it a suicide and opposed the autopsy. The main character looked at the indifferent investigator and replied that his mother was against the autopsy. The police officer closed his eyes and said that the cremated person could not be returned. They could not begin an investigation without leads. Lee Si-ho lowered his eyelids and assumed that it had something to do with his sister's work. He suggested interviewing everyone associated with the bar. The investigator looked at him irritably, feeling angry. The guy remained as calm as possible. The man hovered his cursor over the application's close button and replied that he might have a good alibi. But right now he was the most suspicious. He smiled, covering his mouth with his hand, and asked why not a single muscle on his face moved. Lee Si-ho put his hands on his knees and remained silent. The investigator leaned back wearily and said that they needed more specifics, otherwise they would not begin the investigation. The main character began to get up from his chair and answered in the affirmative. The man irritably opened Solitaire on the computer and said that everyone he met already fancies himself an investigator. His colleague looked at the guy leaving, and the man asked what nonsense he was talking about. Ishiho heard this, but did not respond, not even turning around. He walked towards the exit of the police station, thinking about the Samseong-do area. Night fell, the skyscrapers glowed brightly. Ishiho walked through the streets with neon signs, holding his phone. Consulting his maps, he glanced at the red sign. He walked up to the entrance to Flash's bar. The main character went inside, and in front of him was a staircase leading down. There was an advertisement for alcohol on the landing. He went downstairs and the man asked him if he was alone. It was the bar worker who opened the door and asked if he was looking for someone special. Ishiho hid his face behind his cap and replied that it was his first time here. The worker came inside and offered to escort the main character. There was a man sitting behind the cash register talking on the phone. He stood up from the table loosening his tie. A man in a black suit led Ishiho behind him. At this time, a man in a brown suit spoke to the boss, asking what happened. The main character looked at him, standing with his back to him. He began to look around the room, thinking that this was ground floor 1. About 20 steps down, 5 meters from the entrance, the owner was standing behind the counter. In the center there is a hall and rooms separated by curtains. There was a long bar counter in the middle, and the private rooms had sofas and tables. Ishiho wondered if there was really only one entrance for outsiders. He was sitting on the sofa in one of the private rooms. A red-haired girl looked in and complimented him. She asked if it was his first time here. The girl sat very close to the guy. He answered in the affirmative. The employee warned that behind the bar you can only communicate, you cannot touch. He looked at her creepily, part of his face hidden by his cap. The main character asked if she knew the name Ise-yon. The red-haired girl put her index finger to her chin and replied that she no longer worked here. Ishiho asked to tell us more about this. She just smiled awkwardly and replied that she had quit her job a long time ago, so she didn't know. The main character looked at her suspiciously. He noticed that when she smiled, her eyes expressed tension, and the corners of her mouth involuntarily drooped. The girl smiled tensely and scratched her nose. The guy realized that she knew something. She asked what he wanted to drink. Ishiho pointed to a drink on the menu and asked to bring it. The girl smiled and agreed. She walked out of the private room. The owner looked very pleased. The girl approached him and worriedly said that the guy was looking for Arumi. The owner asked again. She replied that she was talking about Ise-yon. He closed one eye, put his hand on his cheek, and grinned. At the moment when Ishiho entered the club, the interlocutor told the owner that there would be no investigation. But the guy intended to take matters into his own hands. He admitted that the guy was making him nervous, so it would be better to deal with him quickly. The owner turned away from the main character and pretended to talk to the boss. He actually spoke to investigator Han-soo. The owner ended the call with an arrogant face. He stood up from his desk, thinking they were talking about the same person. The red-haired girl leaned against his table and suggested telling the guy that there was no room and kicking him out. The owner, with a grin on his face, began to straighten his tie and replied that it was not necessary. He told her to tell everyone not to talk too much about Ise-yon, and then asked about Siyu. The girl looked at him tiredly and replied that after what happened with Ise-yon, she no longer came to work. The man tightened his tie and suggested that the guy was trying to dig up something, so let the girl pretend she didn't know anything. Ishiho had a glass of alcohol in his hands and asked the girl if she knew anything about Arumi. A black-haired girl with bangs pointed her finger and replied that she didn't know, since she had only been working here for a couple of days. She didn't understand why he was suddenly interested. The woman with the short hair said she was transferred from another branch, so she had no idea at all. A worker with long hair and a ponytail with a nervous face replied that she did not know and asked who it was. A drunken woman with loose hair asked who this Arumi was and said that it was definitely not her. There were many glasses and 2 empty bottles of whiskey on the table. Ishiho lowered his head as his cheeks turned red from intoxication. The worker asked him if he had finished and if he wanted more. The drunken protagonist replied that he was leaving. The red-haired girl asked if he would pay by card or cash. Ishiho held out his bank card. The girl took his card and replied that she would go get payment. He could check the receipt later. The owner made the payment through acquiring. The red-haired woman whispered in his ear that the guy didn't find out anything. She picked up the phone and said it was 1:30 a.m. The owner replied that he understood. The employee went with the bank card and checked to Ishiho while the owner took out his phone. The light from the screen shone onto his grinning face. He believed that it was better to deal with him so that he would not wander around. The manager bowed to the guy, and the red-haired girl waved goodbye. The main character began to climb the stairs. He walked outside, the neon signs blurring before his eyes. Ishiho was very drunk, his cheeks were flushed. He could hardly stand on his feet. Leaning on a lamppost, there was a lot of debris around. The guy looked down and noticed something. Advertising brochures were lying next to his sneakers. He glanced at it, which was hidden by his cap. Ishiho turned away from the pillar as three men watched him. They had unpleasant faces, like bandits. They pursued the main character, keeping their distance from him. The guy walked with his head down. The pursuers looked at each other. Suddenly, Ishiho stopped after stepping into a puddle. He turned around and looked at the bandits with a murderous look. The night city was illuminated with hundreds of bright signs. Ishiho sat down near a lamppost. He covered his mouth with his hand, holding back the urge to gag. Unknown people approached him from behind at that moment. They started looking at each other, smiling widely. The main character heard that they were behind. He lowered his hand and picked up one of the brochures. His rough palm lifted the piece of paper from the asphalt. After that, Ishiho put the hood on his head. One of the strong bandits approached him and put his hand on his shoulder. The main character turned around and asked who he was. The man pointed in the direction and ordered to go there. He led Ishiho away, followed by the rest of the strangers. The dim street lamp began to flicker. After that, the lantern went out completely, plunging the street into darkness. The bandits pushed the main character against a brick wall. He started to get up. The bandits stood in front of him and said that he was finished. They asked if he would treat them to a pub. Ishiho's face was hidden by his hair and he remained silent. The main character clenched his hand into a fist and realized that there were three enemies, and the width of the alley was about 1.5 meters. It will be difficult for him to cope with everyone at once. The bandit with big lips asked why he was silent. Ishiho remained calm, wondering if this was an ordinary robbery or if they had their own motives. The bandit began to get angry and waved his hand. The guy looked at him indifferently and said that he had no money. The bald man clenched his hand into a fist and shouted that he could not walk around Samseong-do without money. One of the opponents ordered the guy's legs to be broken so that he could no longer walk around here. The main character adjusted his cap and wondered if they were somehow connected with the bar where he was trying to find out about Isiyon. A man with a nasty face insulted the guy and said that each blow would cost him 10 won if he even survived. Ishiho put his hands in his hood. He began to take out rolled-up brochures. He stood in a fighting pose, as if holding a sword in his hands. The bandit started laughing and said that it was just paper. The bald man showed 2 fingers and asked how many fingers he was showing because he had drunk too much. The main character looked at them with a furious look and declared that he was giving them a chance to escape. The opponents laughed and began to approach him, saying that it was time to get down to business. While the man was stretching his hands, Ishiho was still standing with a roll of pamphlets. His pupils shrank. He was serious. The owner of the Flash Club sat at his desk and looked at his phone. He narrowed his eyes and asked if they had already decided everything with the guy. The man stood up from his seat and told the manager that he would check the cameras. He entered the code on the door. After that, the lock opened and he went inside. The owner took off his jacket and began walking towards the monitors. The man rolled up his sleeves, underneath which were tattoos. He sat down on a chair and began looking through the camera footage. Camera number 5, broadcasting video from the alley, showed that Ishiho was still dealing with the bandits. This made the owner taken aback. The man closed his eyes and asked why it took so long. Suddenly he opened his eyes. He looked at the blurry image from the cameras where Ishiho and the bandits were. He noticed the object in his hand and decided that it was a knife. In fact, it was a roll of advertising leaflets. With a murderous look, he told the bandits that he had warned them. One of them raised his fist, insulting the guy. The main character opened his eyes wide. He poked the roll into his opponent's neck. After that, he began waving the pieces of paper, striking his enemy in the face. Ishiho ran forward sharply, pushing off from the ground. He got into a fighting stance and raised his fist. The main character hit the bandit right on the head and then stopped. Steam seemed to be coming from his body. The other bandit swore and raised his fist. Ishiho moved forward in a second, pushing him away. He jumped onto the wall and then approached the last enemy. The main character hit him on the bald head and landed on the asphalt. While Ishiho was regaining his breath, the enemy fell to his knees. The guy stood up, after which the man fell on his back. His eyes rolled back. The last opponent began to sweat with excitement and asked what it was. The main character turned to him, and the man, in a panic, asked what it was. The guy's hair and cap hid his eyes. He replied that it was paper. The nervous bandit reached into his jacket pocket and shouted that the guy started it himself. He took out a sharp knife and declared that it was his own fault, and that he would be hurt today. Ishiho narrowed his black eyes. He took a quick step forward. The bandit received a blow to his shoulder, and there was no knife in his hands. He was taken aback and looked at the fallen blade. His face was covered with sweat. He looked nervously at the main character. Ishiho's gaze was cold-blooded, his eyes wide open and his pupils constricted. Although he was holding a roll of paper in his hands, he imagined that it was a bamboo sword. The enemy began to tremble with fear and back away. The guy's crazy eyes flashed in the darkness. In a second, he moved towards the enemy and swung his improvised weapon. The bar owner watched the image on the monitor all this time. He was shocked. The man opened his mouth slightly. Ishiho threw a bundle of leaflets onto the road. After that, he stepped on it and trampled it. The main character adjusted his cap and walked out of the cramped alley. Drops of rain began to fall from the sky. It started to rain. Ishiho lowered his cap to protect his eyes from the rain. He walked forward along the wet road while the signs burned brightly. The camera image showed 3 men lying unconscious. The owner was so angry that the veins in his face were bulging, but he looked confused. The man stood up from his chair and grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. He walked out of the CCTV room and ordered by phone to find Ishiho's address now. His capillaries in his eyes burst. He very angrily ordered it to be done this very minute. The lights were on in Ishiyo's room. The main character sat on the bed and removed the bandages from his arms. He knew that Sua knew something. He lowered his head, remembering their last meeting in the cafe when she hurriedly left. Ishiho was looking at the bleeding palm at that moment. He stood up from his chair and walked to the seat opposite. The main character sat down on the chair where Siu was sitting. He remembered her look of horror. The guy tried to understand what caused her to feel this way. He looked out the window from her perspective, but did not notice anything strange. Ishiho now walked to his sister's dressing table. Then, he pulled back the curtains, looking at the balcony, and assumed that Ishiyo might be being followed by someone. He lowered his eyelids and also realized that those bandits also met him not by chance. He realized that he had to drag one of them to the police station. The modern city was brightly lit. Ishiho's face was reflected in the window. Looking at the buildings, the main character frowned and realized that Sua was definitely not telling something. He wondered if it was dangerous to go looking for her again. The modern residential building was made in white and black colors. The sky was blue. The owner of the bar was sleeping in a large, light bed. Suddenly his charging phone rang. He woke up and reluctantly opened his eyes. A half-naked man answered the call while lying in bed. The interlocutor said that he made inquiries about Ishiyo's elder brother. The bar owner stood up and ordered to speak. The interlocutor said that his name is Ishiho. Now he lives in her studio apartment and collects her things. His mother is in a hospital in Gangnam. Ishiho meanwhile is alone in Seoul. According to the interlocutor, the mother fell ill after the news of her daughter's death. The club owner frowned, squinting his eyes, and asked if this meant Ishiho was in Ishiyo's apartment. The interlocutor answered in the affirmative and said that at first he planned to pack her things and move out, but now he decided to stay. The man got out of bed and put on a blue robe. The interlocutor said that Ishiho is a kendo champion. He imagined his gloomy face behind a protective mask with a bamboo sword in his hands. The man stood in front of the panoramic window. According to the caller, kendo is considered an active sport that has no application in real life, but still he is a champion in this sport. The owner frowned, remembering the camera footage. The interlocutor asked what to do with it and whether to bury it. The man looked at the view from the window, holding the phone to his ear. He looked at the smartphone screen and said that investigator Han Su said that there is no need to do anything yet, we need to lie low. After that, he pressed the call reset button. The owner looked at the blue sky, thinking that Ishiho was a kendo champion. He typed his name into the search bar. The man closed his eyes as he read the information. He grinned and narrowed his eyes and said that kendo really isn't popular in Korea. There are only a couple of short articles about this sport, and that's it. He threw his smartphone onto the snow-white bed. The man walked to the window and put his hand on his hips, thinking that leaving Ishiho alone could be dangerous. His pupils shrank and the veins on his face bulged with rage. He was thinking about how he could resolve this situation without unnecessary noise. Drops of sweat fell onto the wooden floor. The main character's face was sweating a lot. He pursed his lips and closed his eyes. The guy stood on his hands, raising his legs to the ceiling. His muscles were defined. He frowned, his body tense. The main character again remembered how, as a schoolboy, he stroked the crying Ishiyo on the head. The girl smiled and groaned, saying that he was pressing on her head. Ishiho put his hand on her shoulder and said it was over. His sister called out to him, and he looked at her with a questioning expression on his face. She asked what if this happens again someday. They were in the school gym. The main character began to stand up and told her to draw an infinity symbol or an 8. This would be their code. He and Ishiyo stood up from the floor, with a crowd of hooligans and bandits lying behind them. The guy raised his bamboo sword. He helped his sister stay on her feet. Suddenly Ishiho noticed something. His pupils constricted. Isiyon's face showed a look of horror. She was scared. Her older brother pointed his sword at the opponents, standing in front of the girl, and said that he would deal with them. He recited those words as he did a handstand. At that moment someone knocked on the door. Ishiho stood up, sweating profusely, and veins bulging on his body. He got dressed and opened the door to the uninvited guest. Standing in front of him was the owner of the bar, who asked if he was their client yesterday. The main character looked at him coldly and said hello. The owner of the club smiled faintly and said that they rented this apartment for Isiyon as a legal entity, and he thought that there was no point in renewing the lease and agreed with the owner. A sly grin appeared on his face and he said that the owner of the apartment said that someone lived here. Ishiho remained calm. He didn't answer at first. He narrowed his eyes slightly and said that he had not finished packing her things yet. The club owner's face became cold and suspicious. He closed his eyes when Ishiho told him that a 1,000,000 won donation had been made on behalf of Flash's sales representative at his sister's funeral. The guy asked if he did it. The man made a sad face and answered affirmatively, saying that he heard that Isiyon committed suicide and called it a tragedy. It was he who was insung on the donation list. The main character looked at him suspiciously and asked if he really thought so. The owner of the club said that Isiyon was very popular in the club. Other establishments constantly invited her to join them. He remembered her drinking and chatting with a client in a private room. In-sung claimed that he tried to dissuade her, but she was eventually lured to a place called 10 Pro. Ishiho put the glass on the dressing table. In-sung was sitting next to the table. The main character decided to sit on the bed and asked about 10 Pro. In-sung closed his eyes and said that the guy must have heard about them. Among entertainment venues, this is something of a boss in the game. He said that everything was clean there. The girls just sat and chatted with clients. Sensing something was wrong, Ishiho gave him a questioning look. In-sung licked his lips and said that he heard that a very unpleasant incident happened to her there, which could have caused her to commit suicide. The guy noticed that the man began to rub his palms. The main character frowned, starting to suspect him. In-sung looked away and apologized for failing to protect Suung. He grabbed his head. Ishiho didn't believe him. The man's hands were restless. He constantly licked his lips. Also, In-sung avoided eye contact. All this indicated that the man was lying. Ishiho frowned, narrowing his eyes. In-sung reached into his inner jacket pocket and said that he had brought him something. He handed the guy a white envelope containing money. The main character lowered his head. He imagined his sister's crying face. Ishiho looked at his interlocutor rudely and said that Isiyon was killed. This caused confusion in In-sung and he asked to clarify what he meant. The guy stood in front of him and said that he requested a forensic examination. Her body was not at the funeral. In-sung began to worry because he understood that the forensic examination would show everything. The veins on the man's face bulged, his pupils constricted and he frowned. The main character put his hands on his knees and said that tomorrow he would take her body from the morgue, and the results would also be most likely tomorrow. In-sung was taken aback and clarified about the murder. Ishiho looked at him with a cold gaze and said that tomorrow he would go to the police and present the results to the investigator. The man tried to hide his excitement and said that if he needed anything, he could tell him and he would help in any way he could. Ishiho thanked him. In-sung began to get up from his chair and said goodbye. The man walked down to the parking lot of an apartment building, wondering whether the guy was bluffing or not. He turned around cautiously, narrowing his eyes. The club owner began to get into his expensive car, realizing that nothing could be learned because of Ishiho's stone face. He reached his finger to the engine start button. His angry face reflected in the rearview mirror. He thought about what if this was true. In-sung pulled out of the parking lot of the building where Isiyon used to live. While the man was driving, he called his subordinates and ordered them to bury the main character that very night. They asked if they should kill him in the apartment. In-sung removed the phone from his ear and answered in the affirmative with a deadly look. His subordinates were sitting in an abandoned building, where they made a fire in a barrel. The boss told them to clean up after themselves thoroughly, and also asked them to take more people since Ishiho is a kendo champion. There were 4 people in an abandoned building, and a black bag with a corpse was hanging over the fire. The man in the cap who was in Isiyon's apartment earlier told the boss that they would make it look like it was a suicide. Ishiho watched from the window as In-sung's car drove away. He turned away, closing his eyes. The guy opened the door to the bathroom. He focused his attention on something, narrowing his eyes. It was a blue mop that stood between the sink and toilet. Clouds floated in the blue sky above the apartment building. Evening came. The lights began to be turned on in the apartments. As soon as the residents went to bed, the lights went out. At this time, a dark car pulled into the parking lot. The car stopped near the house and 4 people got out. A man with a creepy face and a red sweatshirt was getting out of the car. He said that they were lucky to kill not only their sister, but also their brother, and in the same place. The guy in the cap was taking things out of the trunk. He asked why 4 were needed this time. The man in the red sweatshirt replied that it didn't matter, the main thing was that they would make a lot of money. A man in a black t-shirt put his hand on the car and suggested that they work quickly. He wanted to buy himself some hangover soup. The man in the sweatshirt shouted that he just had to remember his tools and get out. All 4 bandits with creepy faces began to enter the house. It was dark in Ishiho's apartment, and there was a mop brush on the dressing table. There was a mop stick sticking out behind the curtain. The main character was hiding there, holding an improvised weapon in his hands. He looked at the room and realized that the space leading up to the corridor was free, but in some places it was still cluttered. More than 2 people will not be able to pass. There is a wall on the right, so the guy will only be able to deal with them with a few lunges. It was heard that someone began to enter the code on the lock of the front door. Ishiho watched this calmly, thinking that they knew the password to the electronic lock. He remembered in Sung's words that they rented this apartment as a legal entity. He began to get angry thinking about this. He grabbed the white curtain. His face was half covered with translucent tulle. He hid on the balcony so that the bandits would not immediately see him. And Sung was sitting in the CCTV room. He spoke on the phone that Ishiho said that he was ordering a forensic examination and asked if he was bluffing in their opinion. They told him it was a bluff, but he still sent people to him. The man sat back and replied that if he didn't bluff, they were screwed, so he sent them. Investigator Han-Soo left the police station and said that it would be better for Ishiho to quietly hold the funeral and go to Gangdo. In-sung asked for his help. Investigator Han-Soo closed his eyes and replied that if everything was handled as cleanly as last time, the police would not be able to do anything. He ordered the man to force his subordinates to clean everything there until it shined. In-sung thanked him, asking if 1 million would be enough for him. There were police officers standing outside the police station. The investigator covered his mouth so they wouldn't hear and said that he would draw attention to him, and asked him to write it down on his account so that In-sung would give it to him later. The club owner thanked him again and said that in the morning he would go to Isi-yeon's apartment to allegedly ask her brother for the results, and upon finding his body, he would report it to the police. He put his feet up on the table and asked if that would arouse suspicion. Investigator Han-Soo said to go in the afternoon because the results were not coming in the morning. He added that he would only finish work by noon and asked not to disrupt his daily routine. In-sung smiled madly and thanked the investigator. The bandits pulled the door handle to the apartment. A man in a red sweatshirt walked inside and turned on the light, saying that this is how you can become attached to this apartment. The others followed him into the apartment. The leader looked at the bed and realized that no one was sleeping there. He began to look around the room in a panic and asked if Ishiho was at home. His partner in the cap turned to him and replied that they were watching the house and the guy did not come out. He looked into the bathroom and asked where he was while the 2 bandits were looking at something. The man in the Panama hat pointed to the motion sensor and asked to turn on the lights, as the blinking annoyed him. The chandelier on the ceiling turned on. As soon as the light came on, the bandits were horrified to see Ishiho standing in front of them. The gang leader smiled nervously and said that he was scared. They asked the main character who he was. However, the guy stood silently and did not move. The man in the cap put his hands on his hips and said that this was not going well. The leader said that he would have to deal with him and then think about it. Ishiho took a step forward and said that if they were going to loot, then there was nothing valuable here. The gang leader asked how it was that there was nothing valuable. A nasty smile appeared on his face. The main character looked at him, frowning slightly. The gang leader said that the guy's life is valuable. Ishiho stood opposite the bandits, holding a mop stick in his hands. The tulle behind him flutters in the light breeze from the balcony. The bandits threatened that they would not let him in and that he would have nowhere to run. Ishiho put his stick forward. He stood in a fighting pose and said that he was a master of sports in kendo. His eyes reflected the light from the light bulb. He said that he did not want to use martial arts to hurt people so that they have a chance to survive. The ill-wishers began to smile mockingly. The main character did not move. He ordered them to leave. The man adjusted his cap and began to laugh. He exchanged glances with his smiling accomplice. The leader waved his palm, signaling to the others. They all took out their knives and the man in the red hoodie said that Ishiho would die now, and they would take care of the rest. The main character took the stick with both hands and said that it is unfair to beat the weak, so he will finish faster. He held the makeshift weapon as if it were a bamboo sword. The man in the cap was offended by his words. He bared his teeth and was preparing to stab him. Their gazes met, and Ishiho hit him so hard that his knife broke into small pieces. One of the fragments hit the chandelier. The bandits watched in horror as blood gushed from their accomplice's face. The light began to slowly go out. The man in the Panama hat looked at this in horror and asked if the light bulb was broken. The leader's eyes filled with blood. He angrily ordered not to think about it and killed Ishiho. The chandelier lit up for a second. At this time, the remaining thugs attacked the guy with a knife. The light on the ceiling went out again. The main character attacked them in pitch darkness. When the light came on, the bandits screamed from the blow that hit their hands. They dropped their knives. The room became dark again. Ishiho swung at one of the intruders. When it became light again, the guy hit the man in the shoulder, breaking his collarbone. In the darkness, he quickly shifted his gaze. He hit the third bandit, who was wearing a Panama hat, with a stick. The light turned on again. Foam came from the mouths of the defeated enemies. Only the leader remained. When it became dark, Ishiho bypassed the unconscious opponents and came forward. The light bulb on the ceiling came on. The hands of the man in the red sweatshirt were shaking as he held a knife. He looked with horror at the extinguished light bulb. He screamed in panic and attacked blindly. A second later, his knife was already falling down. The bladed weapon stuck its tip into the floor. The main character put the sharp broken end of a stick to the leader's throat. The man was sweating heavily from tension and fear. The chandelier above his head began to slowly go out again. Eventually the light went out again. After a couple of seconds the light turned on. Ishiho was the only one who could stand on his feet. He was still holding the mop stick. The leader was lying on the floor next to him, his face beaten, and foam was coming out of his mouth. It was beginning to get light. The soft rays of the sun fell on the police station building. 3 bandits and Ishiho were sitting near investigator Hansu. The investigator frowned, squinting his eyes, and turned to the main character. He responded with his head slightly tilted forward. The investigator pointed his finger at the bandits and said that they had no criminal record. Ishiho was calm. He put his hands on his legs and replied that they wanted to kill him. Investigator Hansu looked at him in disbelief and asked if he had evidence like a video or something similar. The main character narrowed his eyes and replied that there was no evidence. The police officer replied that then they could not be sure of the veracity of his statements. He started flipping through the report and said that these guys really broke the rules, but Ishiho used force in self-defense, and this is much more serious. This made the guy take aback and frown. The investigator hit the table with a folder with documents. He stated that the guy used a weapon and inflicted beatings, and one person ended up in the hospital with a broken collarbone. According to him, this crime is much more serious. The gang leader, who had bandages on his face and knocked out teeth, shouted that he also needed to go to the hospital. The police officer ordered him to be quiet. Ishiho lowered his head without saying anything. The investigator narrowed his eyes angrily when the protagonist said that he did not understand. While his opponents looked at him, he said with his head down that he was simply defending himself from the criminals who were chasing him, and he barely managed to get away and report to the police. The police officer closed the report folder and said that the law in Korea is not like that. At the moment, Ishiho is a suspect in the case. The main character clenched his hands into fists and asked again. Investigator Hansu looked at him with disgust and replied that since he had a weapon, it was considered an aggravated assault. The policeman led Ishiho away while Hansu followed. The guy was taken to a cell for an administrative term. After that, the policeman locked it. The main character silently looked at the iron bars. An investigator stood opposite him and stated that he was registered in Gangneung, but lived in Seoul. This means that he does not have a permanent place of residence. This is how he explained why the guy was taken into custody. The investigator left and the policeman saluted him. Ishiho looked at the police station through the bars. His cellmate was lying on the floor, picking his ear and asking how he got here. The guy turned around, looking at him. It was a man wearing glasses who was lying on folded mattresses. He had a scar on his lips. The man assumed that director In-sung was personally involved in this. Ishiho continued to look at him. The cellmate stood up and said with a smile that the director was in cahoots with the police, and it was not surprising that this particular squad was on duty today, since they had already made a deal to cover up In-sung. The main character listened to him emotionlessly. The man adjusted his black glasses and asked him to tell him everything, promising to help him get out. Ishiho asked him if he knew the director of In-sung. The cellmate bent his legs and replied that they were once a family. He smiled carefreely and said that In-sung turned out to be a worm. Ishiho pursed his lips in disbelief. The cellmate put his hands on his folded legs and said that he had contacted a lawyer, and he would be here soon. He again said that he would help him get out of here if the guy behaved, asking how he got here. All this time the main character was silent and looked at his interlocutor. The man met his gaze and smiled. Ishiho bowed his head slightly and began his story. At this time, the investigator stood on the street stairwell and asked the interlocutor what he was doing. He said that he sent the guy to the isolation ward, but they couldn't keep him for long, because everything has a limit. The man began to walk down the stairs. His interlocutor was In-sung. The investigator asked not to create problems, saying that he could no longer cover him. Ishiho and his cellmate were sitting on the floor opposite each other. The man with glasses put his fist under his head, looking at the guy. The main character still looked indifferent. The man furrowed his black eyebrows, thinking that this seemed to be true. He brought his fist to his mouth and coughed. The cellmate adjusted his glasses and said that the guy ran into the wrong opponent. An ordinary person is not capable of this. He imagined In-sung bowing deeply and said that the director has many connections. Ishiho slightly tilted his head and asked what to do if this is a difficult person. The man took off his glasses and replied that it was necessary to break the laws. There was no other way out. Not a single muscle on the guy's face moved. While the man was wiping his glasses with a t-shirt, the main character asked if he could tell us more about it. The cellmate said that he completely forgot to introduce himself. He put the glasses on himself, stood up and bowed. His name was Kyangu. He owned a small karaoke bar in the Sinsadong area. Kyangu leaned on the bars and said that he was a bit of a robber. Ishiho looked at him coldly and replied that he was a bandit then. Kyangu lowered one eyebrow, ran a finger along his chin, and said that he was a member of a criminal gang. He looked at the police station and said that he was here on a false charge. Director In-sung's henchmen interfered with his business. Kyangu looked at the duty desk with a grin and said that they often report him, frame him as an illegal business, or even plant drugs. Then he is caught. The man proves his innocence. He is released and everything repeats. He is already used to it. Ishiho said that then In-sung is also a criminal. He introduced him behind Kyangu's back and said that they were probably on bad terms now. Kyangu, looking at the police station, replied that Director In-sung is not the main problem. He said that there is a guy who is usually called the representative of Santee. He imagined a man with black tousled hair who was covered in blood. According to Kyangu's story, Santee defeated the boss they previously served and seized all power. While the Santee representative was smoking a cigar, the rest of the bandits, including In-sung, stood behind him. Then their paths diverged, because Kyangu could not stay with the traitors. He imagined that there were bloody trails behind him while he was standing in the isolation ward. Ishiho looked at him in disbelief and asked if Santee was not punished even though he killed a man. Kyangu raised his hand, grinned, and replied that he was the kingpin. After that, he suggested communicating less formally, because they were almost like friends. The main character, sitting on the floor, replied that he was older than him, so everything was fine. The man grinned and called him stubborn. They were in detention center number 2, as indicated by the blue sign. Ishiho was sitting on the floor. Kyangu lay down on the floor again and asked if everyone was silent about his sister's death. He raised his hand and crossed one leg over the other, saying that this is not the first time In-sung has gotten rid of unwanted people. The main character asked where he could meet him. Kyangu looked at him and asked the guy again. He pursed his lips, covering his mouth with his hand. The man put his hand on his head and couldn't help but laugh. Ishiho's face became blank. Kyangu crossed his arms and apologized, saying that it was impossible. Only people of a certain level can meet him, and the guy has only one choice. The main character looked at his interlocutor and asked what the way out was. Kyangu was full of confidence and told him to go ahead. They locked eyes and silence fell between them. The man adjusted his glasses and warned him to be prepared to go to jail if anyone got hurt. He honestly did not recommend getting involved in this, saying that he had his own life, and let him accept the fact of suicide and move on. Ishiho, hearing this, humbly lowered his gaze. Investigator Han-soo opened the door to their cell. He went inside and ordered Kyangu to go out. The man came to the door and said that the lawyer had arrived. He asked the guy to wait to get him out of here too. The flags on the police station building fluttered in the wind. Kyangu was stretching, and Ishiho was walking next to him. They were on the street. The guy looked at his new friend and thanked him. The man turned to him and asked why he was thanking him, because the guy was locked there by force. If his guesses are correct, they won't be able to continue their investigation since Santee is involved. Kyangu opened his business card holder and took out a business card. He handed it to Yoshiho and said that he could come if he wanted to drink, for which the main character thanked him. The man smiled awkwardly, showing his business card holder, and said that he had nothing else with him and was very hungry. He asked if the main character had money because he had not eaten anything since yesterday. Yoshiho took out his wallet, where the bills were. He handed the money to Kyangu, who took one 10,000 won bill. The man waved this bill and said that this was enough, after which he said goodbye. A tall building with bright sun reflected from its windows. There was a sign near the desk that said K Entertainment. Santi's muscles were very defined. He stood bare-chested with a bottle of alcohol in his hand. A tense In-sung stood opposite his desk, and a girl was sleeping on the sofa behind him. Santi stood with his back to the director. He began to speak and In-sung flinched. The strong man narrowed his eyes and said that if you look down, people really are like ants. He looked out the picture window while In-sung laughed awkwardly, agreeing with him. Santi turned around with a smile on his face. The director began to worry more. He trembled and darted his gaze. His boss took a step forward. He was barefoot. He sat down in his chair, putting his feet up on the table, and said that people could be trampled at any moment. In-sung pursed his lips and swallowed nervously. Santi threw his head back and looked at him creepily, asking what to do then. Yoshiho watched as Kyangu left, holding his business card in his hands. The main character lowered his gaze. He looked at the business card, which had Kyangu's name and phone number. Santi's gaze became increasingly creepy. In-sung shyly lowered his gaze, feeling uncomfortable. Santi's pupils shrank, but her eyes were wide open. Yoshiho's eyelids were slightly drooping as he frowned. Clouds floated above the glass skyscraper. Feeling guilty, In-sung looked at the boss and said that Detective Han-soo said that he could no longer cover for them. He asked to lie low, and there was no way out. Santi opened his eyes wide and asked if he should have done the job properly in the first place. His subordinate said he was sorry. The boss took his feet off the table and asked if such injuries would be counted as self-defense in Korea. In-sung asked if they should start formally suing. Santi folded his hands in front of him and asked what if he was found out in the process. In-sung apologized, his voice trembling. The boss called out to him as the man looked at the sign with his name and position. Santi covered his face with his hands and said that he was 5 years younger than him. His subordinate agreed with him. The boss asked if he would always spoon-feed him, hinting at his incompetence. In-sung shyly looked away. Santi opened a drawer in his desk and ordered his subordinate to talk to Han-soo and sort things out as quickly as possible. The detective will do anything if you give him 2 million won. The boss asked if Yoshiho's house was in Gangnam, to which In-sung replied in the affirmative. Santi took a cigar out of his cigarette case and asked if his mother was alone there. The director answered in the affirmative and clarified that she was in the hospital. The boss took a deep breath of the smell of tobacco and asked if there was anyone at home and if any neighbor children could get in there. A crazy smile appeared on his face and he asked if the house could catch fire. In-sung was taken aback by this question. Santi's pupils dilated greatly and he ordered him to take a photo of Yoshiho's mother with a knife at her throat and send it to her son. In-sung looked up at him in shock. The boss took out a guillotine knife from the box and asked if Yoon had any debts. The director responded negatively and said that this is just a bar for get-togethers and she never even asks for advance payment. Santi began to cut the cigar and ordered to collect debts and tell the mother to pay, asking who cares if her daughter is dead. In-sung closed his eyes and agreed. The black-haired man looked at him from under his brows. He cut off the end of his cigar and asked if losers were really useless. The director narrowed his eyes and pursed his lips tightly. In-sung picked up the landline phone and started dialing the number. He smiled and asked his interlocutor how it went. They told him that they were pumping out blood now. The phone said that all 4 were still alive. He asked if they should be killed. In-sung lit a cigar with a burner and replied that he didn't need them and let them kill them. Heart-rending screams began to be heard from the white telephone receiver. Santi calmly put the phone down, ending the call. He narrowed his eyes and looked at In-sung coldly. The director noticed this look on himself with fear. Sitting with a cigar in his hands, Santi asked what was the matter. In-sung lowered his head and said that he would go to Gangnam and personally look into everything. He bowed respectfully to his superior. After that, he left the office and ran towards the elevator. Santi looked after him. At this time the girl on the couch woke up. Cars were speeding along a 4-lane highway. In-sung was sitting in one of the cars. He ordered the driver to go faster, to which he replied that this was the maximum. The director became so angry that the veins on his face and neck bulged. He ordered to be faster. The driver could only agree, and the car drove even faster. Pink and orange clouds floated over the hospital building. An elderly woman was lying in a solitary hospital room. It was Ishiho's mother. On the cabinet next to her there was a photograph of her children. A nurse came into her room with a tray of food and said it was time for lunch. The woman closed her eyes and shook her head. The nurse put a tray on the table and said that she would starve to death. She asked when her son would arrive and if he had said anything after leaving for Seoul. Someone knocked on the door. In-sung entered the hospital room and the nurse asked who was there. The man closed his eyes and said sadly that he knew the woman's daughter, Isi-yeon. He heard that her mother was in this hospital. The elderly woman opened her mouth in surprise, looking at him. The nurse helped him up and told him she was too shocked to talk. In-sung handed her a box of oranges and said he was sorry. He asked to be left alone with Ishiho's mother to discuss something. The nurse put the gift on the cabinet and replied that the woman was unable to speak. In-sung said that he would just pass on something. The nurse looked at Ishiho's mother, who signaled with her hand that everything was fine. She left the hospital room, doubtful. In-sung looked at the closed door with a smile. Ishiho's mother looked at the man with a slight smile. He turned to her and his face immediately changed to angry. He reached into his jacket pocket and stated that her daughter owed him money under the contract. He took out the document and showed it to the woman. She was horrified. In-sung started poking at the piece of paper and stated that Isi-yeon borrowed 200 million won from him. But since she died, there is nothing to take from her. The woman began to cry and tremble with fear. In-sung narrowed his eyes and called her rude names, saying that she couldn't even say a word. Continuing to point to the sheet, he said that it was a contract with a saloon. He smiled disgustingly and said that her daughter sold her body for money and she went all out on him. Her mother began to sob and scream, hitting her chest. The man leaned towards her and said threateningly that she had to return the money. The sick woman continued to scream and sob while he stood near her bed. In-sung looked at her rudely and asked what she was doing. The woman looked down and said that Isi-yeon is not that kind of girl. Thinking about the photo on the cabinet, In-sung asked if she really thought so. Ishiho's mother clutched the blanket in her hands. With tears in her eyes, she quietly said that her daughter was not like that. Suddenly the man roughly grabbed her graying hair. She was in pain, and In-sung said with a grin that Isi-yeon is just a cheap prostitute who sleeps with everyone for money, like her mother. The woman's hands were shaking. She said that Isi-yeon would never do such a thing. With a smile on his face, he told her in her ear that her daughter was a corrupt girl. Ishiho's mother opened her mouth slightly, tears flowing down her cheeks. She looked pitifully at the man. Her eyes began to become glassy and she was losing consciousness. Her fingers were curled and she was shaking. In-sung was taken aback, not understanding what was happening. He let go of her head and several hairs fell out. The woman fell unconscious and her hand hit the bed. She died with tears in her eyes. In-sung looked on in horror. The lights were on in Isi-yeon's apartment and it was evening. Ishiho sat on the bed and looked at the business card. His establishment was called again. Kyung-gu was the director there. The main character lowered his gaze, realizing that he cannot fight the mafia alone. He wondered if he should give it all up. As soon as he remembered Isi-yeon, he looked up. A call came on his phone. The guy looked at it. He put the phone to his ear and answered the call. He received a call from Gangneung City Hospital asking if he was Yeon Lee's guardian. While he was sitting on the bed, they told him about what had happened. Out of resentment and pain, he pursed his lips, holding back tears. The highway had a speed limit of 60 kilometers per hour, and the road led to Seoul. In-sung sat in the back seat of the car and told his boss that Ishiho's mother suddenly died. The interlocutor asked if he killed her. The director massaged his head and answered negatively. He said that he just wanted to scare her, but she trembled and died suddenly. Santi was dressed in luxury clothes. He ordered to demand a debt from his older brother. In-sung admitted that Ishiho knows something. He told him. Behind the boss there was a view of Seoul at night. He asked his subordinate what was the matter. In-sung shyly covered his face with his hand and replied that he would sort everything out, including the apartment. He looked at his phone screen, where there was a call with his boss. He placed the phone on the seat and tilted his head back, asking what to do now. The driver with the scar under his eye looked at him and asked if the director of Yoonchul lived in this area, suggesting that he call him. In-sung suddenly opened his eyes. He smiled widely, clasped his palms together, and said that Yoonchul could be just the thing to help him. Surrounded by white flowers stood a funeral photo of Ishiho's mother. There were offerings nearby, and the main character in a black suit was sitting on the floor. A funeral home employee approached him and said that a visitor had come to see him. Ishiho raised his head to look at them. It was the nurse who helped his mother in the hospital. They bowed low to each other while sitting on the carpet. They stood up, and the main character asked the woman how she knew his mother. The nurse replied that she had been caring for her in the hospital. He pointed to the dining room and suggested that they remember his mother. They sat at a low table on cushions, with mostly light snacks on the table. The nurse looked guilty and upset. Ishiho looked at her and thanked her for visiting. He said that he asked the administration for her contact information, and they agreed, so this is the first time he is seeing her. The nurse lowered her gaze and nervously said that some people came to see his mother on the day of her death. The guy's look became questioning and he asked what kind of people they were. The woman was rubbing her hands in excitement and said one of them asked her to leave the premises to talk to his mother alone. Then she left the hospital room. In the corridor she ran into a driver with a scar and got scared. The man waved his palm and ordered her to move as far away as possible. She was taken aback, but agreed. The woman said that the man who came into his mother's room was a decent-looking man in a suit. And outside there stood a big guy who looked like a bandit. The nurse looked at him warily. While she was leaving, screams began to be heard from the room. She turned around in horror when she heard In-sung shouting that the woman should repay the debt. The driver looked at her with a creepy face. She immediately turned away, looking at the floor. Sitting in the dining room, the nurse said that she went away and returned 10 minutes later, and his mother was already dead. She had no appetite for about a week and was not eating well. She was very weak. Ishiho looked at the table while the nurse said that those men were no longer in the room. The main character kept his hands under the table, clenching them into fists. Suddenly, noise began to be heard from the corridor. Ishiho turned his head. The bandits swore and broke wreaths, asking who came to the wake of the prostitute's mother. The nurse began to worry, but the main character remained calm. The mafiosi went towards the dining room. Ishiho stood up and asked them who let them in here. The man in the red shirt immediately began to be rude. A man in a shirt with golden roses named Yoon-chul began to adjust his hair. He grabbed Ishiho by the bandage on his shoulder and asked if he was in charge and if the deceased was his mother. His unpleasant face approached the guy. Yoon-chul patted him on the cheek and asked what was wrong with him, because people usually get angry when they say bad things about their mothers. The mafia surrounded him and the nurse. They kicked out the rest of the visitors. The man in the red shirt said that the guy was probably scared. Yoon-chul looked at Ishiho brazenly and asked if his sister's name was Isi-yeon. He looked at his accomplices near the donation box and said that his sister had stolen money from the club and he had paid off the debt. According to him, the debt was 200 million, and with interest it would be 300 million. Yoon-chul stated that they will take all the donations in the box. The main character looked at him coolly and replied that Isi-yeon couldn't do that. A mafioso in a shirt with roses kicked the funeral table. The veins in his face bulged with rage, and he asked if she really couldn't do that. He repeated this question while hitting the guy on the cheek. He continued to slap Ishiho's face, saying that Isi-yeon didn't tell the family because of shame. Yoon-chul grabbed the main character by the black tie. Tugging at his tie, the fair-haired man asked how he was going to pay off the debt. Ishiho calmly told him to take the house. Snacks were scattered on the table and floor. The bandits shouted that he knew about all their property, but this house was now burning and it could not be saved. Their house was on fire and firefighters arrived on the scene. The man with the ugly face continued to press Ishiho. He narrowed his small eyes. The main character still looked at him indifferently. Yoon-chul rudely asked what was wrong with him because he had a face like a robot. His accomplice in the red shirt said that some people become insensible from shock. The fair-haired man looked at Ishiho with a contemptuous face, asking if this was the reason he was like this. The main character had marks on his face from blows. He replied that he had money in the safe and he would bring the required amount. The mafioso smiled disgustingly, continuing to hold him by the tie. He asked if it was really 300 million and when he would bring the money. Ishiho replied that he could after the funeral. Yoon-chul grabbed him roughly by the back of the head. He brought the guy closer to him and asked if he even understood what was happening now and whether he needed to open the coffin. The main character lowered his gaze and replied that today he will bring everything before 12 o'clock at night. The bandit threw him a business card from their organization. The business card fell to the floor. There was the director's name and phone number. They were engaged in the wholesale supply of clothing and alcoholic beverages. The man in the rose shirt shoved Ishiho with his shoulder and left. The rest of the gang also left the dining room, smiling maliciously. The main character stood alone, saying nothing. There was an information desk, there was a TV on the wall, and the clock showed 11:50 p.m. The clock was digital and also hung on the wall. Ishiho was wearing a windbreaker and a cap, and it was raining. He had sneakers on his feet and stood in a puddle. He approached an old building, on the top floor of which there was a light on. There was a cover on the main character's back, which he began to open. He threw his bag on the road straight into a puddle. He held his bamboo sword in his hands while standing in the rain. Ishiho held his sword in front of him. He was full of determination. Yun-chul sat in the office with his head thrown back. He looked at the time on his smartphone. It was almost 12 a.m. He asked his subordinates if the funeral home was closed. The fat bandit with a shaved head answered in the affirmative and said that the lights were no longer on in the windows and the restaurant was closed. He asked if Ishiho would definitely come. Sitting in a chair, Yun-chul laughed and replied that if he didn't come, they would have a reason to kill him. The shaven-headed bandit looked at him and asked why they should be here in full force. There were indeed many members of the criminal organization in the mafia office. They were holding weapons in their hands, such as metal pipes and bats. Yun-chul looked rudely at his subordinate and asked if he knew why they were gathered here. The bandit apologized to him. The gang leader twirled his phone in his hand. He grinned with a nasty face and replied that seeing them, Ishiho should be scared. This is called intimidation. At this moment, the main character was already climbing the stairs. He held his bamboo sword in his hands. Suddenly, his phone received a call from his coach. The guy put the phone to his ear and answered the call. The coach apologized, saying that he was in Japan. He was invited to be a judge at the Kendo Championship. Ishiho stopped at the stairwell. The coach asked if the funeral had taken place and apologized for not being able to attend. He promised to fly tomorrow morning. The main character reached the corridor, which was littered with various rubbish. He asked the teacher not to worry and said that he would call him back later. He removed the phone from his ear and ended the call. Ishiho understood that they might never see each other again, after which he mentally thanked the coach for everything he had done for him. The guy walked forward along the corridor, holding his weapon at the ready. Yun-chul looked at the phone. The time was 12:03 a.m. He grinned maliciously and asked if the guy would come, since it was already midnight. The subordinate turned to him and asked if he thought Ishiho had escaped. The boss replied that, according to him, the funeral home was already closed, and the guy probably ran away, which he did not foresee. The man with the shaved head rubbed the back of his head and apologized to his boss, since he was the one who was supposed to be keeping an eye on Ishiho. Yun-chul started to get angry. He opened a contact on his phone and decided to call. As soon as the interlocutor answered the call, Yun-chul put it on speakerphone. He told In-sung that the guy ran away and didn't come with the money. The director said that he asked to deal with him. Yun-chul replied that he couldn't do it in the funeral hall. There were too many cameras there. Drops of rain fell on their office window. In-sung displeasedly asked how he could even believe that Ishiho would bring money. Yun-chul grinned while looking at his phone and replied that this was his area. It was free of CCTV. He took care of that. He asked if it would be better to get at least some amount of money. Suddenly the bandits heard footsteps outside the door. The boss put the phone to his lips and said that he would call back later. He nodded to his subordinate, giving a sign. The shaven-headed man opened the door as the others in the office watched. Ishiho appeared in front of them, wearing a hoodie and cap. He took a step forward. The shaven head looked at him slightly tensely. The main character entered the office and the mafiosi surrounded him. Yun-chul, sitting in his chair, grinned and said that he thought he had escaped. He asked where the money was. Ishiho's face was covered with hair and a cap. He replied that it was money. The boss began to get angry, veins bulging on his face. He said the guy was hiding something from him. The main character looked at him creepily and asked who he works for. Yun-chul looked at him incomprehensibly, narrowing his eyes. He stood up from his chair and stepped aside, ordering his subordinates to break Ishiho everything they could. A crowd of bandits ran towards the guy. The noise from their feet could be heard throughout the office. They looked at the guy with a grin, preparing to beat him up. He was surrounded on all sides. Smiling men stood behind him. The main character had his sword in his hands. The bandits had metal pipes. Yun-chul walked over to the work desk and asked Ishiho if he thought it was okay to make jokes here and if he thought they were liars. The main character stood silently, his head slightly bowed forward. The boss looked at him insolently and rudely, sitting in a chair, and declared that he was definitely finished, because the door was closed, and he was like a rat in a mousetrap. Ishiho held his bamboo sword with both hands. He again remembered his last kendo competition. There was a poster hanging near the stands. The jury raised a red flag as the commentator announced that Ishiho had finished each round in no more than 20 seconds. According to him, he has seen many fencers, but never one like him. The protagonist stood over his opponent while the commentator said that he had certainly achieved the highest skill. Ishiho was wearing a mask. He narrowed his eyes and exhaled, steam coming out of his mouth. At the moment, his expression was the same. He was exhaling steam. The shaven-headed bandit swung his pipe at him, shouting loudly. Ishiho swung his weapon sternly. He hit the bandit on his arm. A bleeding wound appeared on the man's forearm and he dropped the pipe. He opened one eye and saw the tip of the sword moving towards him. The tip of the weapon hit him right in the neck, causing him to cry and cough. The bandit began to fall unconscious, and Ishiho was immediately surrounded by enemies on all sides. He opened his eyes wide, concentrating. The main character attacked one of the opponents with lightning speed, leaving the rest behind. Blood gushed from the enemy's head. His accomplices looked on in shock. Ishiho quickly took a few steps forward. In a few seconds, he was able to strike 3 opponents at once. They received blows on their hands and fell to their knees, exhausted, while a man with short hair looked at them. Suddenly, Ishiho appeared right in front of him. He dealt him a strong blow to the head. The man's eyes filled with blood. Another gang member was swinging at the main character. However, the bamboo sword hit him directly in the throat, causing him to grit his teeth. Ishiho threw the man back while the rest of the group looked on in shock. While the defeated enemy lay on the table, foaming at the mouth, his ally brazenly looked at the protagonist. The very next second he received a blow to the face. There were unconscious bandits lying all over the office. The man in the red shirt looked at this in horror. Yunchul was also shocked by what was happening and his mouth fell open. The bald bandit and the man in the red shirt began to back away. The rest of the gang were taken aback and looked at Ishiho in horror. Everyone was scared by the guy who was standing in the middle of the office with a bamboo sword. The gang boss narrowed his eyes, dripping down his forehead. The main character looked at him coldly from under his cap. Terribly frightened, Yunchul ordered his subordinates to kill the guy. Ishiho got into a fighting pose. He put his weapon forward. He exhaled slowly, narrowing his eyes. He jumped up and ran forward. The rain continued to fall, dripping onto the roofs of the buildings. The lights were on in the Yunchul group office. This light broke through the raindrops. The window was broken by a bandit who was thrown out. He fell on the asphalt, smashing his head until it bled. Blood flowed down the road, mixing with raindrops. The office of the criminal group suddenly became quiet. One of the bandits was convulsing on the floor. Another mafioso passed out near a shelf with documents. Ishiho's pupils shrank as he walked forward calmly. The only one who didn't lose consciousness was Yunchul. The main character approached his table. The boss was horrified. He pitifully begged for mercy. Ishiho looked at him menacingly and asked who he worked for. Yunchul squinted his eyes. He was sweating heavily. The main character put his sword to his neck, and Yunchul immediately shouted that he had been framed. The guy looked at him calmly and asked what it meant. The gang leader looked away and replied that he was told that they would give bonds for 2 billion for 5,000. He thought it was real and swore that he knew nothing more. There was a TV behind the guy. Ishiho looked sternly at Yunchul and asked who this deceiver was. The frightened bandit, looking at his interlocutor, replied that he was in Seoul and managed several bars. He knew nothing more. The main character remembered his meeting with Insung, not understanding how he was involved. He removed the sword from Yunchul's neck, who looked at his weapon in confusion. Ishiho turned away from him and said that he had received the answer, so he would go. The bandit looked after the leaving guy, not understanding whether this was a joke. He stood up from his chair and began to take something out of his pocket. The main character put his hand on the doorknob, intending to leave. Sensing something was wrong, he turned around sharply. Yunchul was running towards him with a knife in his hand. The guy turned his whole body sharply. With one blow he knocked the knife out of the bandit's hands. The blonde man was taken aback, looking to the side. Ishiho was already preparing to hit him with his bamboo sword. A heavy blow hit Yunchul right on the head, causing him to scream. Even when blood began to flow from his head, the main character did not stop beating. He delivered the final blow to the head, drops of Yunchul's blood falling to the floor. The main character was breathing heavily, holding his sword in his hands. The entire tip of the weapon was covered in someone else's blood, which dripped onto the tiled floor. Ishiho was furious. His pupils shrank and veins bulged on his cheeks. The day came. The funeral hall had a black and white sign. A tall man in a formal suit was in hall number 2. He frowned sadly, pursing his lips. He looked at Ishiho's mother's funeral photo. The man lowered his gaze and head. He looked at the messages in his correspondence with Ishiho. "I'm sorry that I couldn't get in touch myself due to heart problems. I'm very sorry. All the money has been transferred. There's not much money, but use it for the funeral. I'll visit sometime." The man put down his phone and asked what kind of guy he was. The main character was walking down the street near the shops. There were many brightly lit buildings around. The guy looked to the side. He decided to stop on the sidewalk. Ishiho took out the business card that Kyangu gave him. He turned his head, looking around the buildings. The main character realized that he had come to the right place and headed to the karaoke bar again. The metal door opened quietly, creaking slightly. Kyangu was standing behind the cash register. He greeted the guest, but immediately recognized him. Ishiho stood near the stairs, telling the man that he promised to buy him a drink. Kyan-gu replied that he was glad to meet you. The man approached the guy and pointed to one of the private rooms, saying that he would bring him the best girl. The main character sat down on a long gray sofa with green pillows. Kyan-gu walked in with a bucket containing alcohol and glasses. He told the guy that he came early and the girls would only come at 8 o'clock. Ishiho lowered his gaze and said to forget about them, because he had a request. The owner of the karaoke bar put a bucket of ice and alcohol on the table and sat down next to him. Ishiho looked at him modestly and said that he wants to work here. The man grinned, narrowing his eyes, and replied that they had no vacancies. While Kyan-gu was pouring whiskey into glasses, the main character said that he just needed a place to sleep and food. He didn't need a salary. The man asked what was wrong with him and where he was going in such a hurry. The guy lowered his head without answering. Kyan-gu looked at his guest seriously. He pushed a glass of ice and alcohol towards him, suggesting that Ishiho had problems, but he himself could not help. The main character's eyes were hidden by hair and a cap. He recalled that the man then offered something. Kyan-gu narrowed his eyes intensely, asking what he was talking about. Ishiho reminded him of how in the detention center the man told him to go ahead. The man frowned, looking at the guy. The main character lowered his head, hiding his gaze. Kyan-gu smiled as he poured some alcohol for himself. He explained that he told him to just move on with his life, and this is how things turned out. Ishiho turned his head to him and replied that since he also considered the director of Santee to be a traitor, the guy was on his side. He stated that they have different motives, but the goal is the same. Kyan-gu laughed as he picked up the glass. He offered to drink because the guy was talking nonsense. Ishiho looked at him seriously, calling him his elder. The man took a sip of whiskey and asked if he was crazy. The main character lowered his head in shame. Kyan-gu came out of the private room and said that there is nothing for ordinary residents to walk around here. He warned that if anyone heard Ishiho, he would be finished, and he himself would pretend that he had not heard anything. The guy was left sitting alone with alcohol on the table. A vein bulged in his jaw with rage. Ishiho grabbed the bottle of whiskey from the table and took a sip from his throat. After a while, everything around him began to become cloudy as he continued to drink. Above him was a young girl and Kyan-gu, who was asking what happened to him and if he was okay. The girl realized that he had emptied an entire bottle of whiskey. The main character began to slowly open his eyes. A beautiful girl with red hair and light brown eyes appeared before him. Ishiho was taken aback, opening his eyes wide and stretching his hand forward. He called the girl's name Sion and she asked how he knew her name. His hand touched the girl's long hair. Her face was blurry in the guy's eyes. He said that she was alive. The girl was taken aback and turned to the confused Kyan-gu. There were moles on her body and face. She turned to Ishiho again. The girl wrapped her hand around the guy's palm. The main character slept on the sofa in the utility room. He began to slowly open his eyes, experiencing a headache. Suddenly he stood up abruptly, not understanding where he was. He sat down on the sofa and Kyan-gu asked if he was okay. Behind the man on the wall hung a dartboard and a pool cue with balls. He crossed his arms over his chest. The guy's cap was on the table, and his sneakers were on the floor. Ishiho said that he was sorry, to which Kyan-gu replied that he didn't think he would get drunk so easily because he seemed unperturbed. The main character guiltily lowered his gaze without answering. The man stood up from his plastic chair and said it was time for him to go. As he walked towards the exit, Ishiho began to speak. The guy looked down sadly and said that his mother had died. Kyan-gu stopped near the billiard shelf and offered his condolences. Ishiho, sitting on the sofa, said that she was killed. The man turned around. The guy looked down, saying that they were just mocking a sick woman. Kyan-gu looked at him over his shoulder, frowning. The main character clenched his hand into a fist out of anger and said that his mother could not stand it. The man with glasses looked at him, not knowing what to answer. Ishiho put the cap on his head and apologized for causing trouble. He came to the door and said that they would see each other again. As he was about to open the door, Kyan-gu stopped him. He looked down, rubbing the back of his head, and called the guy a scoundrel. The man sat down on a chair and asked if he had somewhere to go. Ishiho responded negatively. Kyan-gu tiredly closed his eyes and allowed him to work here, not understanding why he became kinder. He also added that if the guy has nowhere to go, he can sleep here. They usually hide here during raids. The room itself was small, about 4 square meters. There was a sofa, a small table, and a chair. Ishiho asked what kind of raids. Kyan-gu replied that there shouldn't be raids now, but that's how it used to be. He looked sharply at the guy's face. The man ordered the guy not to stare at him. There was a shelf on the wall containing cues and billiard balls. Kyan-gu put his elbow on the table next to the microwave and warned him not to approach Santee with his stupid phrases, because he could die like that. He said that Ishiho is just a worker. The main character answered in the affirmative, and Kyung-gu pointed his finger at him. He told him to listen only to him and not to take orders from others. They looked at each other. The guy agreed. The man asked how he knew the name of Sion, his employee. A drop of sweat ran down Ishiho's cheek. His cheeks turned slightly red and he asked again. A girl named Sion sat down on the sofa opposite Ishiho, who was standing behind the cash register. She asked if he would start work today. He answered in the affirmative. Sion from the karaoke bar had moles on her nose and neck and smiled friendly. The main character was dressed in a black suit. He apologized for yesterday, saying that he had made a mistake. Sion smiled happily and replied that everything was fine. She said he must have confused her with someone, like an ex-girlfriend. Ishiho looked at the cash register indifferently. He apologized and said that he would be more careful with his words. Sion was taken aback, her mouth wide open in shock. The main character looked at her slightly embarrassed and asked what was the matter. The girl seemed to have goosebumps. She grabbed herself by the shoulders and replied that he spoke like an old man. Ishiho awkwardly lowered his head, his cheeks turning red. Sion came up to him and said with a smile that he was not at all fashionable. She leaned on the cash register, showing a circle with her fingers, and said that all weaklings would be eaten by predators. The main character thanked her for her concern. He turned away from her while she looked at him and asked what kind of phrases these were. The clock on the wall showed 6:30. Kyung-gu put his hand on Ishiho's shoulder and told the others to introduce themselves as they had a new employee. Waiter Hong was 21 years old and wearing a red shirt. Waiter Chial had short hair and was also 21 years old. Manager Ryan was 29 years old, wore glasses, and had her hair tied in a bun. She called the guy handsome. Sion's real name was Soo-jong. She waved and said that they had already said hello. Isun was 23 years old, with short hair and a brown sweater. 30-year-old Irene was a beautiful girl with long black hair. She asked how old the guy was. Young Jai was 22 years old and had blonde hair. She clasped her hands together and called the guy a pretty manager. Do-hee's assistant had short black hair and glanced indifferently towards the main character. Yeonwoo's assistant was a girl with long brown hair and wore a green blouse. Kyung-gu covered his mouth with his hand and whispered to Ishiho to come up with a name for himself. Without waiting for an answer, he patted the guy on the back and told the others that this was Kim Shiho's manager, and he hoped they would get along. The karaoke bar workers smiled and Soo-jong answered in the affirmative. Kyung-gu crossed his arms and told the guy to ask Soo-jong strange things, which made her taken aback. The owner of the establishment raised his foot in the air and ordered everyone to go to work, after which the employees went to their jobs. Kyung-gu started to fall on the sofa. Irene turned to Soo-jong and said that their new manager was cute. The redhead replied that he was very careful. Ishiho frowned and looked at his new boss. Soo-jong thought he would cry when faced with the harsh reality, because this is adult life. A month has passed. While the main character was writing something down, sitting at the cash register, Hong was talking on the phone. The waiter looked worried. He told his interlocutor that he understood everything. Ishiho got up from his chair and asked what was the matter. The waiter nervously replied that we needed to close today. Soo-jong closed the door behind her, asking if it was really today. The main character looked at them blankly. The girl approached the cash register and crossed her arms over her chest, saying that every month they make false denunciations, at which time the boss is sent into custody. The main character remembered how Kyung-gu told him in the detention center that he was here on a false charge. He looked at the police station and said that they often set them up, saying that this is an illegal business or even planting drugs. Ishiho turned to Soo-jong and asked if they could just continue working. The girl replied that without the boss there would be confusion. She said that strange people constantly come. They enter the bar with weapons, demand money and make threats. Ryan came out of the room and said that Ishiho has only recently been here, so she doesn't know everything yet. She pulled out a small microphone from her shirt and told the others to get ready to close. Workers began escorting customers out of the establishment. They were drunk and unhappy, asking which bars closed at 10 p.m. The main character silently watched what was happening. The karaoke bar sign on the street was burning brightly. Suddenly it turned off, indicating the closure of the establishment. All the workers went outside. One of the girls said goodbye to her colleagues, getting into a taxi. There was no one else in front of the karaoke bar. There was darkness all around, through which it was difficult to see the sign. Suddenly the letters began to slowly light up. The sign for a bar called again suddenly lit up. Ishiho looked calm as he narrowed his eyes. He took billiard cues in both hands, preparing for the raid. The red sign of the flash bar glowed brightly. In-sung was standing near the cash register and talking to someone on the phone, asking if they left the door open. They answered in the affirmative and said that the light was also on. The director began to get angry. He narrowed his eyes and asked if Kyung-gu was in the detention center. The interlocutor answered in the affirmative. In-sung frowned angrily, taken aback by his interlocutor's words. He entered the code for the electronic lock on the door. The man entered the video surveillance room. There was a black phone in the desk drawer. In-sung sat down on a chair and started calling from the second phone. He said he had an urgent message and the lights were left on again. He answered the interlocutor that Kyung-gu had been in the detention center for a long time. His interlocutor was Santi, who at that moment was sitting with the girl. He rudely asked the subordinate if he thought he could call this number for any little thing. In-sung apologized and asked if he should go there himself. The boss narrowed his eyes and replied that he left the business under his responsibility. In-sung should be able to resolve such situations himself. A girl with long hair pressed herself against Santi and asked why he was swearing. He looked at her menacingly, his pupils narrowed. The girl felt uncomfortable and moved away. The boss asked what happened to the guy from Gangnam who ran away. In-sung replied that his whereabouts were still unknown. The girl crossed her arms over her chest and watched with caution as Santi took the bottle of alcohol. He shouted that he would kill the guy with his own hands, after which he asked what was going on with the again bar. He raised the bottle to his mouth and asked if they were coping without Kyung-gu. Santi was preparing to drink alcohol, thinking that the only subordinate of Kyung-woo who had any value was Kyung-gu. He didn't understand how again could work now that the owner was in a pre-trial detention center. In-sung asked him what to do. The boss broke a bottle out of anger and doused the girl with alcohol. He ordered his subordinate to shut up and shouted what he thought. In-sung sat in a dark room, which was illuminated by the light of the monitor. He answered in the affirmative. The man looked at the push-button telephone in fear, realizing that despite his wild character, Santi was not stupid at all. He thought that if the boss was stupid, he would not be able to outsmart Pyong-wook. While In-sung was sitting in the CCTV room, Santi ordered him to send T-Chang there. After finishing the call, In-sung massaged his head. It seemed to him that it was like using a tank when a gun was enough. He wondered if Santi suspected something. Ishiho was sitting on the sofa near the entrance. He heard a noise and looked towards the source of the sound. Several cars drove up to the entrance of the establishment. A man in a black suit got out of an expensive car. Walking towards the karaoke bar, he turned around. Armed people also began to emerge from the remaining cars. The entire road was blocked by an army of bandits and their cars. One of them put a sign on the road that travel is prohibited. The bandit ordered random passers-by to leave here. The mafiosi lined up in a semicircle. One of the subordinates approached the boss's car and said that they were ready. The door of the black armored car opened. A cigarette butt was thrown out of the car onto the road. A bald, strong man stepped on a cigarette butt as he got out of the car. He was dressed in black and had a goatee. It was T-Chang. His ear was broken, like a real wrestler. T-Chang looked around at his subordinates who stood next to him. The man looked at the switched-on sign of the karaoke bar again. He took out some chewing gum and said it was incredible. T-Chang blew a bubble gum and asked what happened to him, because they were quietly doing business. While he was pulling pink gum, a subordinate asked if he should come in. The boss replied that they could simply have forgotten to turn off the lights after finishing work, and ordered 2 people to be sent there to check whether the establishment was open or not. 2 men in suits entered the karaoke bar. Ishiho slowly began to get up from the sofa. There were billiard cues and a pink telephone with rhinestones on the sofa. The bandits with unpleasant faces looked at the guy and asked if he was new and if the club was open. The main character looked at them coldly, without answering. He turned to them and answered in the affirmative, clarifying that today there was only food and drink. The strangers began to grin and grin disgustingly. They left the establishment and told the boss that the guy inside said the club was open, only they had never seen the employee. T-Chang told them that it is now clear that the new employee does not understand what is happening. The man with black hair asked him what they would do. The boss grinned disgustingly, narrowing his eyes, and replied that they would teach this guy a lesson. He spat pink gum onto the asphalt. A subordinate opened the door for him, and another man handed T-Chang a metal stick. He wrapped his hand around the cold iron. Walking at the head of the gang, T-Chang led them inside. The light was on in the hall, and a letter hung on the wall. Hearing the noise, Ishiho turned off the light. He prepared the pool cues as he walked towards the entrance. He concentrated and looked forward. He did not know when and how such an attitude towards the owner of the establishment appeared. Constant denunciations, living in fear, walking on eggshells. The metal door to the club began to open. The main character understood that once such an attitude was established, it was not easy to change. Armed mafiosi entered the establishment. Ishiho could understand why one day the thought arises that nothing can be changed. T-Chang was the last to enter the bar, placing his pipe on his shoulder. He looked at his subordinate and ordered him to close the front door. The man turned the latch on top of the door. Ishiho crossed the pool cues while an army of bandits stood in front of him. He promised himself that today he would change this attitude forever. The main character stood in a fighting pose, preparing to repel the attack of ill-wishers. T-Chang flexed his fingers while looking at the guy and asked if he was going to fight them. He said that he didn't intend to kill anyone, but now he definitely will. The boss smiled unpleasantly, narrowed his eyes, and said that the main character is now like a rat in a trap. Not a single muscle on Ishiho's face moved. He calmly replied that they were like rats that had fallen into a trap. This angered T-Chang, and veins bulged on his bald head. The protagonist's pupils shrank. He was imperturbable. 4 years ago, Ishiho, wearing a white sports uniform, stood in front of the gym. He narrowed his eyes, which were partially covered by his hair. The guy took both bamboo swords from the table. Other students in black uniforms stood nearby with swords in their hands. The top of the bald man's kimono was white as he looked at Ishiho. It was announced that Ishiho from the university's sports section was entering the arena, and would now hold a demonstration. Holding 2 bamboo swords in his hands, the main character was surrounded on both sides by other swordsmen. As Ishiho waited for his opponents to attack, commentators discussed that in Korea, kendo is seen as a hobby, but Ishiho is not exactly an ordinary swordsman. They were interested in comparing him with a Japanese master of sports named Yuta Shinsuke, who won the Japanese National Kendo Championship for 5 years. The opponents shouted loudly, signaling the start of the match. Ishiho began to fight off his opponents with 2 swords at once, and the commentators shouted that this was a Nido Ryu, which he had honed to perfection, just like his Ido Ryu. They said that Yuta Shinsuke does not own Nido Ryu. The main character deftly repelled the attacks of several opponents at once. He lunged forward, keeping his face calm. The presenter said that Nido Ryu is the art of fencing with 2 swords of different sizes. It is said to be suitable for fighting multiple opponents. At this moment, Ishiho just decided to use Nido Ryu against the bandits who entered the club. Having hit the first enemy in the neck with a cue, he remembered the words of the commentator. Shoto can help cut a path through a crowd of attackers, while Nido Ryu provides greater mobility when fighting multiple opponents. Pointing a long cue at the second opponent, he remembered that the Shoto is followed by a Dado, and does not allow the opponent to get close from behind. The short-haired bandit began to back away and screamed. This was followed by a synchronized blow that hit the enemy in the head. He screamed heart-rendingly as blood poured from his head. One enemy broke through from behind Ishiho. He hits the bandit's wrist with a shoto. This is a defensive technique. In Nido Ryu, defense plays a central role. The main character hit the enemy in the body with one of the cues. After that, he struck the opponent who had approached from behind, making a hook with a cue. While the bandit was falling, he hit his accomplice with his elbow. The accomplice was unable to maintain his balance and hit T-Chang. The boss threw it aside and shouted to the rest of his subordinates that they were stupid. Ishiho quickly ran towards the uninvited guests. In a few seconds, he struck 3 enemies, leaving T-Chang at a loss, and ran forward. Leaping forward, he jabbed the cue into the curly-haired man's chest. All the other bandits began to run away, screaming in horror. The main character looked at them from over his shoulder. He changed his position, leaving some of the enemies behind him, and jumped forward towards the fleeing enemies. He hit 2 men on the head in one motion. All this time, comments from his demonstration, which took place 4 years ago, were spinning in his head. Unconscious mafiosi were lying around his feet, and blood spattered everywhere. T-Chang stared at Ishiho intensely, a bead of sweat running down his bald head. He grabbed his metal pipe and asked the guy where it came from. The main character silently looked at the enemy. T-Chang ran forward sharply, swinging his pipe, and ordered him to speak. Ishiho easily stopped his attack with his cue. He was holding a metal pipe. His face was like stone. T-Chang looked at him with a slight smirk, frowning. Suddenly the guy began to move the first cue away from the pipe, lifting the second cue up. After holding off T-Chang's attack, he decided to attack him with a second cue. The bald boss's pupils shrank in fear. He put his pipe away, looking at the guy's right hand. It was a feint. Ishiho distracted his attention, and then sharply hit T-Chang on the head. The top of the bald bandit's head immediately began to bleed. He fell to his knees, clutching his wounded head. The main character looked at him coolly, raising his hand. Blood flowed down the man's face, getting into his eye. Ishiho hit him on the head a second time, causing more blood to splash out. T-Chang's eyes rolled back and blood gushed heavily from the wound on his head. He fell unconscious at the guy's feet. A light haze swirled around Ishiho. It seemed to him that he was standing under bright spotlights in a white kimono. There were defeated students around him. This was the end of the demonstration. The spectators began to applaud. Ishiho extended his hand to one of his defeated opponents. The demonstrators waved to the spectators, while Ishiho just looked at the stands. However, at the moment he was not in the gym, but in a dark club. He exhaled slowly, steam coming out of his mouth. He closed his eyes, a bead of sweat running down his face. The main character wiped a drop of sweat from his cheek. The floor of the hall was filled with defeated enemies. Ishiho looked around. The bright sun reflected from the glass of the skyscraper. Santi was wearing a branded shirt and sat on his chair with his arms crossed over his chest. With a serious face, he quietly asked if T-Chang had been defeated and if those 20 people had failed. There was a smartphone on the white desktop. The boss was talking on the phone on speakerphone. He was told that perhaps Kyan-gu had taken his people. Santi wrinkled his nose while looking at the screen. He folded his hands in front of him, placing it under his head. He ran his thumbs over his chin, thinking that the guys who had been sitting in silence suddenly decided to rebel. He did not exclude the possibility that they had much more trump cards. The interlocutor asked whether they should deal with them. The boss covered his face with his hands and assumed that they were waiting for their attack. His face became creepy and aggressive. He believed that this was a trap and they knew that they would come for revenge. He asked his interlocutor if he was himself. The subordinate apologized to him. Santi put his hands on the table and leaned back in his chair. He clenched his teeth angrily, realizing that he first needed to assess the situation. The boss clenched his fist tightly and ordered his interlocutor to convey his words. Karaoke bar again is located in a small alley. Kyan-gu stood in the lobby of the establishment, his eyes wide open. He looked at Ishiho, who was mopping the floors, and asked if it was true. The main character replied that last night a group of guys attacked, and he defended himself. The owner of the establishment rubbed his forehead while the guy looked at him and asked why he didn't close the door and wasn't he warned. Ishiho replied that he himself told him not to listen to anyone else and just do the job. Kyan-gu opened his eyes, frowning. He was taken aback. Ishiho reminded him that a month ago in the back room he told him not to interfere with Santi and just work. He pointed his finger at the guy and ordered him to listen only to him and not take other people's orders. Now Kyan-gu put his hands on his hips and lowered his head. Now everything was clear to him. The main character looked at him emotionlessly and said that the furniture was almost undamaged, and he cleaned up everything else. The man frowned and looked at him, saying that was not what was important right now. He sat down on the sofa, clutching his neck, and said that his blood pressure had even risen. Ishiho took out a phone in a pink case from his pocket. The screen was smashed to pieces, but the guy promised to compensate for the damage. Kyan-gu picked up the phone and answered that it belonged to Sujong. He frowned and said in a serious tone that a war would soon break out because of the guy. Ishiho lowered his head and asked what he meant. Sitting on the sofa, Kyan-gu asked him to come here to talk. The main character put the mop in the pantry, where there were also drawers and a cooler. He placed a chair in front of the sofa and sat down opposite the boss. Kyan-gu handed him a stamped bank card, saying that he opened a bank account and deposited the money the guy earned there. He told him the PIN code so he could withdraw the money himself. After that, the owner handed him a white smartphone in a box. He registered the phone in his name and linked it to his account. The fee will be debited automatically. Ishiho thanked him. Kyan-gu lowered his head and said that's all he can do and let the guy leave. The main character was taken aback and looked at him questioningly. The man with glasses bowed his head and said that Santi's henchmen had already called him. They said that if he handed over Ishiho, they would forget everything, but he couldn't hand over the guy. The main character looked down sadly. Kyan-gu covered his face with his hand and said that if he kept him, they would have a reason to pester him, so they would have to say goodbye. He suggested they say the guy ran away while he was trying to hand him over to them. Kyan-gu closed his eyes, turned away, and said that this was the only way out. Ishiho looked at him calmly and said that there was another way out. The owner opened his eyes slightly and asked which one. Sitting on a bar stool near the cash register, the main character said that you could tell they wouldn't leave it like that if they bothered them one more time. Now they will dictate the terms, according to the guy. Kyan-gu exhaled tiredly, leaning back on the sofa. Ishiho looked at him and asked what was wrong. The man irritably took off his glasses and said that he needed to think rationally, because he was behaving like a schoolboy. This was more reminiscent of a baby trying to buy a professional fighter. The karaoke bar had white walls and brown square decorations. The guy imagined himself in a kimono with a sword on the top of a snowy mountain. Ishiho said that for several years he held the top position in a certain field. Kyan-gu threw his head back, closing his eyes, and said that in Korea, kendo is not a professional sport, but just entertainment. The main character imagined the sunset sky behind him and replied that he was talking about the world level. The owner opened his brown eyes. Ishiho continued to imagine himself on a mountainside, saying that he had reached the top. Kyan-gu was taken aback. The main character was full of confidence. He looked at him with his blue eyes. The guy said that you shouldn't run from some opponents, you need to fight them back. Kyan-gu closed his eyes again, his mouth slightly open. Holding his glasses in his hands, he asked if Ishiho thought he could do it alone. The main character answered in the affirmative. Kyan-gu put his glasses on himself and said that since the guy is so arrogant, he will explain everything to him. Against the background of the night city, two men, a bearded brunette and a white-haired one, stood with their backs to each other. Not long ago, Seoul was divided between the Donhee group and Chanyi. However, suddenly the leader of the Chanyi faction named Sanchan nominated his successor. The bearded boss put his hand on the black-haired guy's shoulder while his subordinates stood behind him. During the process of unifying Seoul, a successor named Do Hyun, D-Man, who provided active support, died at the hands of the Donhee group. Near the elevator, a man in leather gloves was filming a corpse with a blue heating pad on his head on his phone. D-Man's daughter Jae-hee inherited his shares. Although Jae-hee prevented the unification of Seoul, the Do Hyun group did not hold a funeral. New boss Chanyi approached Jae-hee and said that the redistribution of power would soon begin, so the shares would be distributed. The Do Hyun group divided the captured territory, and Jae-hee received the Gangnam Golden Lands in recognition of her father's services. Jae-hee looked down sadly. She had long black hair. She was even promised independence. But Jae-hee declared that she was not a bandit and tried to transfer all matters to Pyongwook. She and the man were sitting at the table, sorting out documents. Pyongwook was a black-haired man with moles on his cheeks. He was D-Man's comrade and only cared about Jae-hee's well-being. That is why he did not interfere as long as the subsidiaries paid their rent on time. On the street at night, subordinates bowed to Pyongwook. Then a problem arose in one of the subsidiaries. Kyan-gu worked for this company. There were yellow letters taped to the office windows. Young Kyan-gu wore round glasses and drank from a paper cup. While he was sitting on the sofa, he noticed someone entering the room. Santi was involved in this problem. He wore a black jacket with a fleece. His look was just as cruel. One day, Santi gathered boss Kim-er, deputy Gon-woo, In-sung and Kyan-gu. They were all sitting in the office around the coffee table. Santi leaned back on the gray sofa and said that Pyongwook was only concerned about money. He proposed to capture the lower groups. A middle-aged man in a black jacket named Kim-er asked if they would give up Pyongwook and make way for Do Hyun. Santi tapped his finger on the table and replied that Do Hyun would occupy Seoul so they would expand their influence. According to him, they need to keep paying Pyongwook. They should attack Do Hyun and take over all of Seoul. Kim-er raised one eyebrow and told him to be realistic since it's not that easy. Santi looked at him menacingly, narrowing his eyes. A man in a black jacket was sitting in a chair. He told the guy to stop talking nonsense and focus on business. Santi asked everyone if they agreed with this. Young Kyan-gu put his fist under his head, looking at him. Don-woo is the deputy head of a trading company. He had graying hair and light-colored clothes. He said that since the boss said so, they should listen to him. There was nothing more to say. At that time, In-sung held a higher position than Santi. He was holding a smartphone with a stock chart in his hands and smiling. The veins on Santi's forehead bulged with anger and he called everyone cowards. Kim-er was taken aback and looked at him aggressively. Santi left the office, loudly closing the door behind him. Kim-il called him an idiot. Gon-woo grinned as he turned his head. He said that if Santi was pacified, he would quickly apologize like a guilty child. Kim-er closed his eyes in irritation and put his hand on his head. That night, screams were heard throughout the luxurious mansion. Kim-er, wearing a robe, went out into the yard and asked what was going on. Opposite him stood Santi, whose face was covered, and there were unconscious people lying on the lawn. Kim-er asked who he was. Armed bandits immediately appeared behind him. Santi began to twirl a long iron stick in his hands and declared that he had his ambitions. The man was taken aback. The guy in black clothes took off from his seat. He ran towards Kim-er with lightning speed. Santi swung his stick. The boss was confused. The guy hit him brutally on the head. Kim-er began to fall as blood poured from his forehead. Santi had a furious look. The boss pointed a finger at him. The crazy guy took off his mask, grinning. He fiercely attacked Kim-er on the head with a stick. Kyan-gu told this while sitting in the lobby of his establishment. He also said that Santi quickly overthrew his boss. Suspecting nothing, Ganwu rejected the offer to join forces and fled to the director, one of the 17 lower organizations of Pyongwook. Kyan-gu himself followed his brother Ganwu. Ishiho, who listened carefully to the story, asked if there was anyone higher than the president of the company. The bar owner responded that Santi rallied the remaining people and quickly expanded its influence. He imagined Santi sitting on a red velvet throne. Of Pyongwook's 17 organizations, 14 were already under the director's control. The main character remembered In Sung's face and asked when he joined. In Sung then came to bow to Santi. Kyan-gu replied that it was the day after his boss died. He went to see Santi, whom he had previously looked down on. Ishiho lowered his eyelids slightly and asked which 3 factions Santi had not yet led. Kyan-gu frowned and seriously asked why he was so curious. Long bangs fell onto the main character's face. He said that we must first join forces. The bar owner waved him off and told him not to say anything stupid. Ishiho lowered his gaze thoughtfully. They were sitting across from each other when Soo-jong walked into the bar and asked what it was. Ishiho and Kyan-gu turned their heads towards her. She was wearing a blouse and skirt set, and the girl looked sadly at her pink phone. She lay down on the cash desk and started crying. They asked her why she had already returned, but she only talked about her phone. Ishiho turned his head towards her and apologized, saying that he would pay for the repairs. Soo-jong stood up from the table and asked if he would really do this. The main character answered in the affirmative. The upset girl approached him and said that she bought the phone only 3 years ago. Ishiho awkwardly turned away from her and said that he was sorry. Soo-jong crouched down to look at his face. The main character was lifting a bar stool while the girl told him to write a promise because she needed proof. Kyan-gu told them that there is no time for this now, it's time to go. The guy and girl turned away from him, to which the man shouted that they were not listening to him at all. The multi-story office building was illuminated by bright sunshine. Santi asked if they escaped. He stood in front of the panoramic window and spoke on the phone. The interlocutor replied that they were unable to catch them. Kyan-gu is waiting for a personal apology. The director was holding an expensive smartphone in his hands. He didn't understand anything. While the boss held the phone to his ear, the other party asked what they should do. Santi made a terrible expression and ordered to go ahead. Ishiho was sitting in the closet, writing something down, with Soo-jong standing next to him. The main character wrote a promise on a piece of paper that he, Ishiho, promises to compensate for the breakdown of Soo-jong's phone. The girl looked at this with a smile. The guy handed her a sheet of promise. She pointed to the cooler and asked what was there. Ishiho looked there. Suddenly Soo-jong poked her finger on his cheek. Soo-jong started laughing until she cried, saying that he was caught. The protagonist's face turned red with embarrassment. The girl tore the sheet with the promise and said that everything was fine. Ishiho objected and said that he would make up for everything. Soo-jong threw the pieces of paper into the trash and asked the guy where he was going. Ishiho replied that he had not decided yet. The girl turned to him and asked excitedly if he would be back soon. Suddenly Kyan-gu entered the storage room and called out to them. He grabbed the wall and shouted that people from Sikangam would come soon. The main character asked what it was. Kyan-gu put his hands on his hips and replied that they are one of the 14 Santi factions. They provide labor. He looked at the guy and said that if he was interested, he could look on the internet. Soo-jong was scared. The owner put his hand on her shoulder and told her to go. He promised to tell her later. Ishiho stood up from the black chair, looking at the phone screen. He entered a query into the search bar, Sikangam Work Agency. The main character looked at Soo-jong. The girl looked like she was about to cry. The guy took a step and coldly said that they would be here soon. Soo-jong was scared and taken aback. She looked worriedly at Ishiho, who looked serious. Kyan-gu sat at the cash register with his hands in his pockets. The black landline phone on the table rang. The man picked up the phone and answered the boss's call. The 3-story building was filled with signs from various establishments and organizations. On the top floor there was an office with letter stickers on the windows. Ganwu was in the office with a glass in his hand. He said it was like him and Kyan-gu said there was a problem. The bar owner stood up from his chair and replied that he would sort it out soon. He apologized for causing trouble. Ganwu asked if T-Chang had solved this problem. Kyan-gu narrowed his gaze and replied that he said so. He couldn't be sure. He began to worry, a bead of sweat running down his cheek. He asked his interlocutor if he thought. Ganwu looked out the window with a smile. He asked if one man could stand up to a crowd of armed gangsters. He was sipping his coffee. There were fresh flowers and 2 katanas in his office. Kyung-gu asked if he knew what powers Santee had at his disposal. There are 14 business groups, and each has several subsidiaries. Santee is a monster and has gathered people like him around him. Gon-woo looked at the 2 katanas on the stand and asked when he managed to get up like that. Kyung-gu replied that now they should lie low and keep a low profile so as not to get hit by Santee. Gon-woo's gaze became serious and determined. He asked when to expect payment of the debt for killing the boss and betrayal. The bar owner said nothing at first, lowering his gaze. Holding the telephone receiver to his ear, he replied that this would definitely happen, but not right now. Gon-woo looked at the street from the window, agreeing with his interlocutor because he was thinking about it. He said that he would like to get to know the guy better. The name means Ishiho, and asked to bring him to him. Kyung-gu began to worry. He asked if it was true and why he needed it. He said that he sent the guy away because he was afraid of a big mess. He believed that if Santee wanted to get to him, they would already be dead. Gon-woo turned away from the window and replied that he understood and was sorry. Kyung-gu said that he will try to mislead Santee and find out what he needs. The clouds were reflected in the windows. Gon-woo asked when he was returning from Seekingam according to them. Kyung-gu replied that Ishiho had not returned yet, but time had already passed. 20 minutes ago, the man was playing on his mobile phone. On the window it was written about instant money loans. It was the Seekingam building and it was 2 stories high. The glass doors were thrown open and Ishiho walked up to the entrance. His face was emotionless and calm. He understood that they could not destroy everything around every time. He began to climb the dirty stairs. The dilapidated and dirty door to the office began to open. There were a huge number of mafiosi in the room. Ishiho entered there. The bald leader leaned over while sitting on the couch and asked the guy how he could help. The main character looked to the side with a calm face. He saw a bag containing several golf clubs. Ishiho could be seen from the 2nd floor window. He said he was looking for a job. The black landline phone on the table rang. The bald leader answered the call and said that he understood everything. He walked towards Ishiho and told him that they were currently having a meeting and asked him to come back later. The main character ran his hand over his hockey stick and replied that he had just left the again bar. The bald bandit raised one eyebrow and was taken aback. Ishiho raised his head and said that he was just a security guard, but people came and started a fight in the bar. According to him, they wanted to transfer him to some other place, but he did not want to and therefore ran away. The bald man started to frown and walked in the other direction, asking if he had met T-Chang. He asked to wait a second. The leader went to the phone and picked it up. Covering his mouth with his hand, he told his interlocutor to go up to the 2nd floor. He should see it. The interlocutor asked why. Because they would soon leave here. The main character looked at him with suspicion. The interlocutor said that he wanted them to come at all costs later than Sancho. The bald bandit said that a guy came here who claims to have met T-Chang, and he came safe and sound. The interlocutor asked if he really believed it. The bald bandit looked back warily and replied that he needed to check. The interlocutor agreed to come over. He was the same man on the 1st floor who was playing a mobile game. Suddenly he heard knocking from the direction of the 2nd floor. He raised his head irritably from his chair and asked what that noise was. The man ran outside the office when he heard screams. He ran onto the stairs and began to climb up. The bandit burst into the office and asked what was going on there. His face changed suddenly. He was confused. He opened his eyes wide and his pupils shrank in fear. Ishiho was holding a club in his hands. He and his weapon were covered in blood. The entire office was filled with the bloody bodies of bandits. Near the cooler lay a man with knocked out teeth, and someone had broken fingers. Unconscious men were lying on the floor, on the chair, and even on the nightstand. Ishiho stood opposite the bald leader, who was sitting on his knees and muttering something. The main character hit him. He remained calm. The frightened man with a red tie decided to leave there. However, Ishiho decided to throw a golf club at him. The stick hit him right in the back and knocked him down. The man fell head over heels down the stairs. Ishiho turned to the door and ordered the bald bandit to drag him here, to which he agreed. The man got to his feet and ran towards the exit. At this time, Kyung-gu was leaning against the cash register and looking at the smartphone screen. He decided to go outside, not understanding where Ishiho had gone. Putting his hands in his pockets, Kyung-gu began to climb the stairs. Suddenly his pupils shrank in horror. He had only heard of Seekingam, but did not understand what it was. There was a whole crowd of mafiosi in black suits standing in front of his bar. Kyung-gu ruffled his hair, sighing softly. His black hair was now down, and he looked at his opponents seriously. The sky became overcast with gray clouds and it began to rain. Drops fell on the asphalt near the feet of the bandits. Drops of rain flowed down Kyan-gu's glasses, which reflected the opponents. The gang was led by a man with an undercut. The bar owner had his hands on his hips. Kyan-gu narrowed his gaze, tilted his head, and called the leader by name Sanchol. There was a crowd of subordinates behind Sanchol. He smiled and greeted the man. He said that he was sorry that they met under such circumstances. They were once a family. The rain wet Kyan-gu's hair. He asked an old acquaintance what circumstances he was talking about. The grin didn't disappear from Sanchol's face. He asked if he knew that only Chang-su, the director of Seekangam, wanted to come. He looked at the crowd of bandits and said that there were many more willing to come. Sanchol stopped smiling and narrowed his eyes brazenly. Kyan-gu lowered his head and replied that he wasn't expecting them. Sanchol put his hands in his pockets and grinned. He asked if he was that naive and if he knew who the mafiosi were. With a mocking face, he stated that they could remove him, and then Gon-woo, there was nothing he could do. According to him, in this way the boss of Santi will be able to expand his influence. Hearing this, Kyan-gu frowned and his pupils shrank. Sanchol smiled, showing off his snow-white teeth, and said that everything is very simple. The bar owner narrowed his eyes, understanding why they had come. The vein on Sanchol's forehead was bulging and he looked crazy. He stated that Kyan-gu will die today. A man with shaved temples and the back of his head, Chang-su, was kneeling in front of Ishiho, who was wiping blood from his face. The main character looked at the bandit, asking what was the matter. Chang-su looked down guiltily and said that the guy was right. At first, he thought that Kyan-gu hired people to protect himself, and he wanted to see what would happen next. However, Kyan-gu begged for mercy and reprieve. Ishiho was sitting on the armrest of the sofa. He asked if Chang-su had sent people to him again. The man replied in the affirmative and said that about 40 or 50 people had already headed out to deal with Kyan-gu. The clubs in the bag were on the floor next to the plant. Ishiho asked what his role was. Chang-su replied that he was just a bait. The main character narrowed his eyes, looking at him, and asked why he didn't run away. Chang-su looked at the floor, speaking uncertainly. Raindrops hit the windows of the office where they were talking. The rain outside the window turned into downpour. The man closed his eyes and guiltily replied that they were from the same family. Even though Kyan-gu was higher in rank than him, he treated him with respect. He felt a little ashamed, so he decided to stay. Ishiho looked at him as it began to get dark outside. Kyan-gu ran into his bar as quickly as he could. He closed the door behind him. Using the sofa, he decided to make a barricade in front of the entrance. The bar owner gritted his teeth angrily and called the mafiosi freaks. A crowd of bandits had already begun to beat against his door. The hinges on the door fell off, giving them the opportunity to break through. An army of men armed with iron pipes began to run inside. They moved the door to the side, walking around the sofa. Kyan-gu took off his glasses and threw them on the floor. He got into a fighting pose, holding his fists near his face. While the subordinates were moving the sofa, Sanchol broke the monitor and asked if Kyan-gu was sure that he could survive this fight. He had never seen the bar owner like this. Kyan-gu smiled confidently and said that he still has things to do while he is alive. Sanchol grinned madly while holding the metal pipe and told him to have no illusions. Still smiling, he nodded his head. The bandits screamed and ran towards Kyan-gu, preparing to attack him. The heavy downpour was not even going to end. Ishiho ran as fast as he could, his clothes getting wet. He ran around residential buildings through puddles. The bandits were cleaning the floors in the Seekangam office. Chang-su was sitting on a chair holding a phone in his hands. The bald bandit stood next to him, and he suggested going there too. The man with the red tie asked if he wanted to become Santi's enemy and die painfully. He sighed and covered his face with his hands in shame. He said that he was just a small-time bandit and he needed money. Chang-su didn't want to betray him. The bald man had bruises on his face and was taken aback. Chang-su's hands were shaking as he held the phone. He closed his eyes and nodded his head. After that, he decided to call Gon-woo. Beats could be heard within the walls of the karaoke bar again. Kyan-gu punched the curly-haired bandit in the face. Then, he uppercutted another opponent. He dealt with enemies only with the help of his fists. The bar owner crouched down, sweating profusely. There were 4 defeated opponents behind him, but even more enemies stood in front of him. Kyan-gu was hit in the jaw by a bandit with a metal pipe. He dodged the attacks, preparing to strike further. With a powerful blow to the face, he knocked the bandit down. Sanchol looked at the beaten subordinate and called Kyan-gu a psycho. Out of confusion, he threw his metal pipe at him. The bar owner was taken aback when he looked at him. He was able to dodge the thrown weapon. However, he stepped on a pool of blood and slipped. He was hit on the back and the man screamed in pain. The bandits began to beat him fiercely while he was lying on the floor. Kyan-gu gritted his teeth, his face covered in blood. He was able to get to his feet, but could not maintain his balance. The bar owner fell to his knees as Sanchul ran towards him. The enemy brutally kicked him in the head. Drops of blood were everywhere. Kyan-gu fell again. Sanchul pinned his head to the floor with his boot. The enemy extended his hand, ordering him to give him a weapon, and called Kyan-gu worthless. The subordinate had already handed the iron pipe into his hands. Smiling mercilessly, Sanchul swung his weapon. A white phone was thrown in his direction. Sanchul looked back, sensing something was wrong. The phone hit him right in the face. He grabbed his face while Kyan-gu looked at the falling phone. When the smartphone was near his face, he opened his mouth in surprise. The man remembered that he had given Yishiho the exact same phone. Kyan-gu clenched his teeth and his pupils shrank. Sanchul's temple was cut. He turned around angrily and asked who did it. While he was pinning Kyan-gu to the floor, he realized that Yishiho had arrived. Several bandits were immediately thrown back. One of the bar owner's eyes was closed. He was shocked. The main character broke through the crowd of enemies, holding an iron stick in his hands. Kyan-gu remembered their first meeting in the detention center. Then, he remembered how Yishiho asked for a job while the owner poured whiskey. He couldn't forget how the main character talked about his mother in the utility room. Then his hand clenched into a fist in anger. That day, Kyan-gu sat with him in the back room and told him to just work and not interfere with Santi. He imagined Yishiho at the top of the snowy mountains, saying that he was the best and everything was available to him. The main character looked at Kyan-gu seriously and said that he would make them obey. Yishiho ran his slender fingers along the metal pipe. In one movement, he dealt with several enemies at once. Sanchul watched in horror as his subordinates were brutally beaten. Lying on the floor, Kyan-gu looked at him in amazement. He understood that this guy was from a completely different league. Behind the protagonist, enemies were convulsing while he hit another bandit in the head. His weapon, hands and face were covered in blood. The downpour continued, raindrops falling on the sign of the Again bar. Someone was walking through the puddles towards the establishment. There was a huge number of mafiosi with black umbrellas standing in front of the bar. Among them was Ganwu. He looked serious. Upon entering the establishment, he was surprised. The man looked at the stairs to the karaoke bar, where the bandits were lying passed out. On the table was a sign with Santi's name and position. The boss was holding the phone, which rang sharply. He looked at the screen and saw that Ganwu was calling him. With a grin on his face, he answered the call and asked if he was joining his side. Ganwu smiled and replied that he was standing next to the Again bar and Director Santi's people were everywhere. He asked what to do about it. The boss immediately began to get angry. He was taken aback. Ganwu looked at the stairs and said that he would let them live. The walls and floor were covered in blood. The man said with a grin that their property had been damaged, so they would need to pay for the damage. Santi chuckled and grabbed his head, asking him if he ate something wrong. Ganwu turned around, still smiling. Suddenly his face became menacing and creepy. He called Santi by name. His pupils constricted and he wrinkled his nose. The man said that this was not his concern at all, and when Santi betrayed the boss, he ran to seek shelter in the organization. It's just one of 6 businesses that he was entrusted to manage. Santi gritted his teeth in anger without saying anything. Behind Ganwu there were many members of the group. He said that he had not captured this group yet, and they were not afraid of him. He smiled madly and asked if Santi wanted war. It seemed as if they were talking live, standing face to face. Ganwu ordered him to prepare to pay the damages. He moved the phone away from his face and ended the call. One of his subordinates came down the stairs and asked what they should do and whether they should help the injured Sanchul. Ganwu came down to him, patted him on the shoulder and told him to leave him. The subordinate watched in surprise as the boss came down to the establishment and told him that Sanchul was not a threat. Ganwu pinned Sanchul's head to the floor with his foot and said that if they get rid of him, then Santi will think that they no longer have any aces up their sleeves. A beige office chair was thrown against the wall. Santi threw his computer and phone off the table in anger. He screamed loudly and then broke the table into 2 pieces with his fist. He stood with his head bowed. Steam seemed to be emanating from his body. Santi gritted his teeth in aggression, realizing that he needed to think things through carefully. Kyan-gu ended up in custody, but the bar continued to operate, which became clear when his people arrived there. The boss sent T-Chang there, but he was defeated. Blood gushed from his head and his eyes rolled back. Santi frowned as his black hair fell over his face. He thought they had something ready to hit him, and Kyan-gu was too flexible, so he put him out. But his guys were defeated, and then Ganwu appeared. Santi pursed his lips and lowered his head. He imagined Ganwu's creepy face and assumed that the man had thought this all through in advance. Suddenly the boss raised his head and his pupils constricted. He assumed that a traitor had appeared among his comrades. Ganwoo was sitting on the sofa with a glass of whiskey in his hands. Opposite him was Ishiho. The graying man grinned and asked him if he was new, since he seemed to have been kicked out. The main character bowed his head slightly and replied that he had nowhere to go, so he returned. Ganwoo raised the glass to his lips with a smile and asked if he himself had dealt with his opponents. Dashing Ishiho was calm. He replied that half had escaped. The man took a sip of whiskey, looking into his eyes. He loudly placed his glass on the table and said that he heard that Santee was involved in the murder of his family. Ganwoo stood up from the table, looking at the guy. The man took a step forward, tapping his black shoes. He approached Ishiho and said that he was interested in him. After that, he asked what the guy himself thought about this, but the main character did not understand him. Ganwoo extended his palm to him. Looking down at the guy, he invited the guy to catch Santee together. Ishiho looked at the outstretched palm with an emotionless face. They still shook hands firmly. The sun reflected from the glass of a multi-story office. Santee sat in the bright meeting room, holding a bat. His company's sign was above his head and he lowered his gaze, resting his bat on his shoulder. Chang-Su was standing in the corridor. The secretary opened the glass door and said that the director Chang-Su had arrived. The man walked into the office and Santee lowered his bat, telling him to sit down. Worried, Chang-Su pushed his office chair away from his desk to sit down. The boss looked at him and said that he was the only one who came, so he could sit closer. Chang-Su sat right next to Santee, bowing his head. The chief's hand rested on the handle of the bat. He said that out of the 4 groups that he sent, Seekingam was the only one that held out to the end without giving up. Chang-Su looked at the table, avoiding eye contact, and replied that some guy just burst in and ruined everything. They sorted everything out and moved out late. Santee's lips barely parted as he said that's how it was. Chang-Su introduced an army of people in front of a gen bar, and replied that Ganwoo's gang was already there. According to him, the part that went earlier was already crippled, and they decided to retreat. Santee looked at him menacingly, holding his bat at the ready. Chang-Su tried not to look him in the eye, feeling uncomfortable. The boss lowered his head to the hands that held the bat and called out to the director. Chang-Su's body immediately got goosebumps and he responded. Santee asked how old he was. As sweat ran down the man's face, he replied that he was 45 years old. The boss looked up, smiling widely, and asked if he was 10 years older than director In Sung. Chang-Su was very tense and responded negatively. Santee stood up from his chair with a grin, causing his subordinate to become nervous. The boss walked up to him, his white sneakers squeaking. He put a bat in Chang-Su's face and asked if he was sucking up to Ganwoo. The bat hit the man's temple, causing him to tense up even more. Santee put a bat on Chang-Su's head and asked if he would follow his orders or if he wanted to die. The subordinates closed their eyes in horror and promised to follow all his instructions. A beige residential building. The sky was blue. Ganwoo and Ishiho were standing outside apartment number 507. A man in a blue sweatshirt opened the door and invited them in. Ganwoo entered first and looked back at the main character. As soon as they entered the corridor, the man said that this was an underground hospital, because in regular hospitals they were reported to the police. Kyung-gu was lying on a hospital bed with a drip. He was surprised when he saw the guests. The owner of the establishment with a bandaged head immediately began to get up, but Ganwoo calmed him down and told him to continue lying down. The underground doctor left the room and Kyung-gu asked what was the matter. The man walked up to his bed and replied that Chang-Su's manager told him everything, which made Kyung-gu taken aback. Ganwoo introduced a nervous Chang-Su who calls him. The man said that even though he was on the side of Santee, he still had warm feelings for them. They were once a family, and Chang-Su thought of going on strike and joining them after Sanchul finished work. Kyung-gu, sitting on the bunk, asked if he could just switch sides. Ganwoo replied that was the plan. It was dangerous to stay there. Ishiho stood silently next to them, listening carefully. Chang-Su ran out of Santee's office into the street in fear. He stopped near a lamppost to catch his breath. Passers-by looked at him strangely. Chang-Su had a cut on his cheek and a look of horror on his face. While Santee held the bat on his head, he ordered to set up a meeting with Ganwoo and tell him that he wants to commit treason. The place will be Namyangju. Chang-Su was taken aback, looking up at him. The boss slammed the bat hard on the table, causing the subordinate to get scared. Chang-Su looked at the bat with his mouth slightly open, afraid to say anything. Santee's terrifying gaze was fixed on him. He stated that he was using it to get rid of Ganwoo. The subordinate's hands trembled with fear. He answered in the affirmative. The boss looked at the bent metal bat and ordered Chang Su to contact him and tell him that Santee suspected him of being a traitor. The distraught boss swung the bat with a cool face, saying that if he starts acting weird, he knows what will happen. He dealt a brutal blow to Chang Su's head. Drops of blood hit the office wall. Chang Su had a grimace of horror on his face and a deep cut on his cheek. At the moment he was standing near a lamppost, breathing heavily. He said he had to do this for his life. The man took out his phone, sweating profusely. Ganwoo's phone received a call from Chang Su. The man smiled, looking at the screen, and said that he seemed to have heard their conversation and called. He answered the call and put the phone to his ear. Chang Su said that he wants to commit treason. Kyung-gu sat on the bed, carefully watching Ganwoo, who was slightly taken aback. But suddenly a satisfied grin appeared on the man's face. Ishiho watched as Ganwoo told him that he just wanted to contact him. He smiled friendlily, welcoming Chang Su into their ranks. Chang Su himself looked tense, beads of sweat running down his face. Ganwoo asked if he knew that he was also involved in spreading reputation. Putting his hand in his pocket, he closed his eyes and said that was why he was complaining not to him, but to the head of the reputation-spreading department. Chang Su was still standing on the street. He replied that at this point he was saying goodbye to him, and a little later he would find out exactly the place and contact him. Ganwoo removed the phone from his face and said with a smile that he would be waiting for his call. Santee sat in his beige office, looking out at the view from the panoramic window. He turned to the table and reached for his phone. Bowing his head, he called Park's boss and introduced himself. Several skyscrapers rose above trees with yellow leaves. The Park boss was riding in the elevator with his subordinates. He replied that he was just waiting for his call. Santee said that their boys made a mistake regarding the Again bar. The elevator's electronic interface showed they were on the 7th floor. Santee said that they want to mend their ways and repair their relationship. The elevator doors began to open. Park's boss was a gray-haired old man. He laughed and said that he did not expect to hear such a thing from him. Santee lowered his head and said that they were thinking about compensation of about 100 million, and asked the boss's opinion about it. Black curly hair covered Santee's face as he held the phone to his ear. Park's subordinates opened the door for him, and the secretary bowed to him. The boss replied that 100 million is not enough. Santee asked how much he wanted. Park and his entourage entered an office full of people. All the workers lined up in 2 lines and bowed to the boss. Park said he needed 300 million, all in cash. Hearing this, Santee sitting opposite the window was taken aback. Park's subordinates opened the door to an elite office for him. The boss said that was reasonable and asked if it would be better to leave the 500 million in bonds as collateral. Santee sat with his head down. He said he will prepare 300 million. He needs to launder the money, so he will deliver everything personally. After that, he asked where he should go. Park sat down in a leather chair and laughed. He replied that he would notify the location the same day. Then, he asked by what time he could have everything ready. Santee covered his mouth with his hand and said to give him 3 days and at 7 p.m. he would bring everything. But let Park immediately send him the places. He hung up the call and hung his head. Santee stood up from his chair, raising his shoulders. The boss called someone again and was waiting for an answer. Chang Su answered the call. Santee's lips barely moved as he spoke. He said that he would have to do it in 3 days at 7 p.m. Looking at the river outside the window, the boss said that at that time he should be in another place on an important matter. But this was the only way to reach an agreement. Chang Su said that he understood everything. Santee hung up the call with him, looking at the screen. He walked closer to the panoramic window, running his hand over his forehead. A disgusting grin appeared on his face. The sign for the Again bar was not lit because it was daytime. Ishiho was standing behind the cash register and Soo-jong was next to him. Men in blue uniforms were wheeling the chair out of the lobby. The girl pouted offendedly and crossed her arms over her chest, asking what happened to the director. While the main character was wiping the table, he replied that the owner was injured and therefore control was transferred to him for a while. Soo-jong looked at him angrily and said that since they couldn't work for 3 days, they should compensate her for the damage. Ishiho awkwardly looked away from her, looking at the cash register. The girl leaned on the table and smiled brightly, asking if it was nice. The main character looked at her with an emotionless face. Soo-jong walked up to him, smirking, and ordered him to make amends. Ishiho replied that he had no money, to which the girl said that she was not asking for money. She asked him to go on a date. Soo-jong stood so close to the guy that his cheeks turned red. She said that she was bored today, and Ishiho was taken aback. The girl put her hands on her hips and asked if he was moving into the store. The main character awkwardly rubbed the back of his head and answered in the affirmative. Evening came. The lights began to come on in the offices. The park boss sat down at his desk and asked if this was a complaint. Ganwoo was sitting in a chair. He answered in the affirmative and said that they used to be one family. He reached for a cup of tea and said that Santi had something to do in the evening in 3 days, and he could only leave at that time. He also noted that the meeting place is far away, in Namyangju. While Boss Park was taking wine out of the refrigerator, he said that he had a deal with Santi that day. Ganwoo asked if he trusted him. The elderly man poured wine into a glass and replied that he promised to come in person. Ganwoo presented the creepy face of Santi and called him a snake. He looked at Park and said that he would bring his fighters. The boss sat down in the chair next to him and asked if he would bring Chang Su. He said that if so, then there will be enough fighters. The old man pointed to 2 strong men and said that he had Min Hyuk and Jin Sik. Ganwoo raised his cup of tea, agreeing with him, but said that he would bring another person with him, who turned out to be a very good friend. The park boss held a glass of wine in his hands, asking who it was. The interlocutor replied that this is a man who seeks revenge on Santi due to the loss of his family. The old man looked into his glass and said that the guy was probably in despair. Ganwoo took a sip of tea and replied that he didn't know, but he probably couldn't bear to live. He remembered drinking at a Gen bar. Ishiho's gaze was hidden by his bangs. As soon as he raised his head, his eyes full of confidence appeared. The man wondered if the guy could really wait in eternal torment until Santi died. The pink cafe building looked like a doll's house. An embarrassed Ishiho sat on the pink sofa opposite Soo-jong while a waitress dressed as a maid stood next to them. His colleague told him to prepare properly. The main character blushed deeply from embarrassment and covered his face. He shook his fist and tried to sing along, feeling ashamed. The sweet maid held out her hands to him, wishing him bon appetit and calling him master. At this time, Ganwoo was wondering what would happen if something went wrong and the guy was sacrificed. Soo-jong held out a fork of wrapped spaghetti to Ishiho. Ganwoo thought that he had nothing to protect, and if he sacrificed himself, then that would be fate. The main character embarrassedly wiped the paste from his cheek while the girl laughed. Ishiho looked happy as he blushed and smiled. The main character and Soo-jong walked together through the city at night. The girl hummed something while Ishiho was talking to someone on the phone behind. Walking with a serious face, he repeated the words of his interlocutor that he would send a list of names in 3 days. As soon as he removed the phone from his ear, Soo-jong called out to him. She turned to him and with a sweet face asked if they would go for a walk tomorrow. While people were leaving the underground passage, he asked her again. The girl reminded him that he said it would take 3 days and asked him to entertain her for those 3 days. The main character understood what she was talking about, bowing his head. Suddenly he remembered how, as a schoolboy, his sister called out to him. He turned around with a confused face towards her. His sister looked at him the same way Soo-jong was now. The girl clung to her older brother. They were already approaching the entrance to the school, where the rest of the students were standing. Ishiho patted his sister's head while she hugged his arm. The main character and Soo-jong were passing by an izakaya. Suddenly the guy stopped on the sidewalk. The girl turned to him in confusion. Ishiho looked at her and said that she chose the wrong person in his opinion. Soo-jong was taken aback by the question, looking at his face. They stood opposite each other as townspeople walked past them. The izakaya sign was brightly lit. Soo-jong asked what it meant. People around looked at them while the girl asked what he meant by saying that she chose the wrong person. She ordered him not to run away and to tell her everything. The main character took the girl by the hand. Lowering his gaze, he began to take her to another place. They found themselves in an empty playground, a couple sitting on a bench. Soo-jong looked offended, and Ishiho lowered his head. His gaze was blank and he coldly said that he had killed someone. The girl looked at him tensely and asked why he did this. The main character narrowed his eyes slightly, without raising his head, and said that this man said unspeakably insulting words to his dead mother. As Soo-jong looked at him with worry, he said that this man was the reason for the death of his mother and sister. Looking at the playground, Ishiho said that he was trying to find those who destroyed his family and make them pay for it. He said that after that he would surrender to the police. Soo-jong looked at the sky as she said that he did the right thing by killing them. The main character turned his head towards her in surprise. The girl frowned at him and declared that they deserved to die. She asked if Ishiho trusted her and what if she handed him over to the police. The lantern burned brightly. The main character lowered his head again. He replied that she is honest with her emotions, and he always hides his feelings, and he can tell by her actions. The main character raised his head. Soo-jong put her hands on the bench and clarified, is he telling her not to like him because he will rot in prison anyway? Ishiho did not look her in the eyes and apologized if she had already assumed something. Sujong tilted her head and smiled, saying that she thought he liked her. She asked if he hated her then. The main character turned to her and answered negatively, trying to justify himself. The girl put her index finger to his lips. She smiled widely, closing her eyes, and replied that she was satisfied that he did not hate her. She added that she would think about the bad outcomes later. Lights began to come on in residential buildings near the playground. The guy started talking about his future, but Sujong told him to forget about the future and enjoy the present. There were many slides on the playground. The main character lowered his head and remained silent. Sujong admitted that next to him she is such a fool who does not care about the future. She decided to just love someone she already liked. Ishiho understood that he was not in a situation where he could fall in love with someone. The girl said she was an expert in unrequited love. For the main character, the result was obvious. Sujong said that later when it hurts, she is ready to cry a lot. The lantern near the gazebo illuminated everything around. Sujong looked at the guy lovingly and said that now she just wants to enjoy their relationship. The girl asked not to push her away. Ishiho looked at her silently, part of his face illuminated by the lantern. Sujong closed her eyes and pressed herself close to the guy. He was a little confused, looking at the girl's peaceful face. The main character stroked her hair without pushing her away. She opened her eyes slightly, smiling sadly. 3 days have passed. Many bandits stood in the underground parking lot. They lined up in the corridor. There was a chair near the wall, and the head of Park was heading towards it. Almost all the bandits had weapons. An elderly man and his subordinates walked past them. Jin-sik turned his attention to Ishiho, who was standing among the crowd. He approached the main character and rudely asked who he was. As Park's boss sat down at the chair, he replied that this was Gon-woo's friend who should be helpful. He also said that Santi said he won't pay a dime. Jin-sik looked at the guy with contempt and asked, is he trying to show off by sending only one person? He told Ishiho that if he accidentally died here, it would be a wasted sacrifice for someone else's family. The main character listened to all this in silence, looking down. Jin-sik turned away and ordered the guy to leave, because he would be useless. Nin-hyuk asked if he has to speak so openly. He put his arm around Ishiho's shoulder and said that they would have a bloodbath with Santi, but someone would want to run away from the fight. Nin-hyuk ordered the guy to wait outside and take care of those trying to escape. The main character looked into the distance and replied that he understood. He took a step forward towards the exit. Nin-hyuk and Jin-sik looked at him with a grin. As Ishiho walked towards the exit, they said that he was so weak and afraid that he could not deliver the final blow. They said they would catch everyone and hoped the guy wouldn't whine and beg to save him. The main character walked out to the elevator, his face frowning. The bandits lined up in a semicircle around Chief Park and his subordinates. The old man looked at his watch and asked why he had not come yet. Everyone started laughing when Min-hyuk said that he was scared. An expensive foreign car began to pull into the parking lot. Bright headlights hit Park. Min-hyuk asked if he would appear. The car stopped abruptly. There was smoke near the wheels. Santi got out of the car without turning off the headlights. He walked towards the bandits while they were blinded by the light. Santi's pupils shrank, with a creepy expression on his face. He said that he came alone, as agreed, and asked who these two were. The park boss, sitting on the chair, smiled and replied that he had decided to play it safe, apologizing for his caution. Santi grinned, showing his snow-white teeth. The old man asked with a satisfied smile where the money was. Standing next to his car, Santi replied that he had just entered, and although the parking lot on the first floor was empty, there were several dozen people hiding on the second floor. This caused the others present to be taken aback. A huge number of people began to arrive in the parking lot, and Santi asked Park if they wanted to lock the exit from above and corner him. His army of bandits was approaching him, including In-sung. Santi flexed his bloody fingers and said that he started there. Old Man Park jumped out of his plastic chair in shock. A crazy grin appeared on the black-haired guy's face and he declared that he had come to rip their throats out. The park boss's eyes turned blood red with anger and he cursed loudly. Min-hyuk ran towards the enemy with an iron pipe, threatening to kill him. Two armies of bandits ran towards each other. Everyone had weapons. They were shouting and waving iron pipes. Namyeongjo. It was dark and a white SUV was approaching the villa. Gon-woo was driving the car and stopped near Chang-soo. The mustachioed man began to sit in the passenger seat. The graying man put his hands on the steering wheel, looking out the window. He urged Chang-soo, saying that he only came because he said that there was no one else. He added that he could not leave the park chairman alone. Chang-soo closed the door and looked down guiltily, apologizing. He said that this might be their only chance while Santi is distracted. Gon-woo replied that he understood and asked what about his family. The car started to leave the parking lot. Chang-Su replied that he was alone at the moment. The graying man glanced in the rearview mirror. After that, he turned his gaze to the passenger next to him. A brutal massacre took place in the underground parking lot. Min Hyuk roughly punched his opponent in the face. Santi leaned against the bumper of his car, rolling up his sleeves. He assumed he would have to deal with it himself. He quickly ran towards Min Hyuk and called out to him. The man turned around in fear. Getting as close to his opponent as possible, Santi swung. With a crazy smile, he punched Min Hyuk in the face. The blow was so strong that he flew back and dropped his weapon. Min Hyuk began to stand up, covering his bloody nose. While Santi stood in a fighting pose, the man ran towards him and swung his hand. His fist almost caught the face of the guy in the white branded shirt. However, Santi smirked and blocked the blow. Min Hyuk's fingers were broken and he screamed in pain. After that, the guy in the white shirt grabbed him. Santi threw the man over himself while standing on one leg. Min Hyuk hit his face on the green floor due to a suplex. The rest of the bandits looked on in horror. Chairman Park and Jin Sik were also taken aback by what they saw. In Sung tensed, closing his eyes. Sweat ran down his face. Santi began to rise, with a slight haze around him. He said he would go first and lead the way. He opened his eyes wide, smiling madly, and ordered everyone to follow him. The guy took a step forward, his black boots clicking. Suddenly he ran forward with all his might. He was heading towards the director of Park. The old man gaped in horror. Santi's face looked crazy as he smiled widely. Jin Sik stood in front of Park, blocking him from the guy. He ordered the others to stop the enemy. Santi slipped past Jin Sik, catching up with the running old man. He tripped him and Chairman Park began to fall. Jin Sik gritted his teeth and turned around nervously. In Sung appeared next to him, preventing him from escaping. Santi pressed the old man to the floor, sitting on him, and declared that all his businesses now belonged to him. Let him sign the documents. Park began to panic and say that he would sign everything. The distraught guy pressed his hand to the old man's head and asked if he was begging him to live. He stated that he only needed his fingers to print. Holding his head with one hand, Santi grabbed the neck of Park, who begged him not to do this. He dug his fingers into the old man's throat, causing him to wheeze. In one motion, he tore out the throat of the park director. Blood sprayed out.